Chapter 467. This was the fire seed. It had slumbered in the darkness for thousands of years, and the faint light was like the first rays of dawn in the darkness. A goddess reached out her hand and guided her children forward with a warm smile. Everyone was shocked by this scene and could not speak for a long time. Even Brando was no exception. Lady Martha, Scarlet, Siffred, and Mephistopheles muttered in a daze. She had never given up on her children. It was as if she had been slumbering for thousands of years, but the fire had stubbornly burned through the darkness until her children came here once more. It was a lighthouse, but it exuded a gentle and great power that could penetrate the hearts of people. Brando raised his head, a rare solemn expression on his face. This was the passing of civilization. Countless years later, they would come here again and pick up the torch left behind by their ancestors, allowing the light of civilization to pierce through the darkness once more. A sacred feeling flowed through his blood. He could feel the impenetrable power pulsing through his veins even when he closed his eyes. It was the yearning of all intelligent beings for civilization, order, and light. When Prometheus ignited the first fire seed in the vast and dark land, civilization walked out of ignorance for the first time and began its never-ending search for the world of light. It was a feeling that was passed down in his blood, and it would suddenly awaken at a specific time. It was as if a horn was blown across the vast land, instantly bringing people back to the time when they were pioneers in the wilderness. This was the will of the ancestors. Brando took a deep breath and looked back at the others. Mephistopheles nodded at him, while Scarlet nervously placed her hands in front of her chest. Siffred looked at them, then at Brando, puzzled. "Then I'll go. Let the light of the fire spread across the land." Brando replied. "Go." The Ash Sword Saint looked at the lighthouse with a solemn expression. Brando turned back and walked up the stairs to the large crystal. The crystal continued to emit a gentle light. When everyone raised their heads, they saw him walking towards the light step by step. The light actually turned into feathers behind him, looking more and more like the robe and crown that he was wearing. At this moment, a maxim from Cruz's pale poem suddenly flashed in Mephisto's mind. "Child, I will give you a pair of wings made of light. Only then can I make you king." Although he thought it was nonsense, the Ash Sword Saint's heart couldn't help but beat faster in such a situation. It was as if Brando was approaching Martha step by step, and the supreme goddess was about to crown the young man who had lowered his head. But he didn't know that this feeling was even stronger in Brando's heart. The closer he got to the light, the more intense it became, as if it wanted to swallow him whole. He stretched out his hand and placed it on the crystal. His heart pounded, and he couldn't help but think of this sentence. "Lady Martha, after thousands of years, your child has returned to this place." But what happened next scared Brando so much that he almost let go of his hand and rolled down the pyramid. This was because without any warning, an unfamiliar consciousness responded from the crystal. This consciousness gently wrapped around him and sighed, "Yes, it's been a long time, my child." This, Brando's mind went blank for a moment, and only a voice echoed in his mind. "This is Martha. This is the mother of all things, the pure and kind will of the world, Martha." The goddess that countless NPCs and players had been praising actually existed. But this is impossible. It was as if thunder had exploded in his mind, and the mighty roar instantly caused his thoughts to crash. No player would think that Martha would still exist in this world in the era after the gods had disappeared. Although she left behind kindness, what was left was just a memory. People kept recalling this goddess, hoping that she would still stay in this world and continue to look after her children. Because the people of the world needed a spiritual pillar in order to survive. Martha no longer existed, and the only thing left between heaven and earth was the connection of the laws. After the 4 kings of the saints, this was the common understanding of everyone. But no one would have thought that the supreme goddess was still on this land, silently and eternally looking after her children. No one would have thought. Brando also didn't think that, for some reason, the moment he heard Martha's gentle voice, he actually felt something wet rolling down his cheeks. The strong emotions couldn't be stopped, as if at that moment, after being separated from his mother's warm embrace for thousands of years, he felt that soft gentleness again. "Ah, sand got into my eyes," Brando said, a little embarrassed. Martha smiled. "Don't cry, child. Although I am very far away from you, I can still feel your pursuit and yearning for the light. I have seen civilization come out of its infancy, pass through the dark land, split open the thorns, and stagger out of the wilderness step by step. One day, I believe that you will overcome these difficulties and achieve the final victory. You who have inherited the ancient bloodline are the best children of mankind, you should be strong," she said softly. "Victory?" Brando was stunned and a little confused. Martha shook her head gently and asked, "So my child, are you prepared to ignite this flame and follow the path of your predecessors? You understand, the torch of civilization is passed down from generation to generation, and when the predecessors fall, the descendants pick up their will again. This kind of history is originally written with the most tragic and brave epic of the mortal races. This is a game for the brave, and everyone is a part of this magnificent epic. So my child, you came here, are you prepared to accept all of this?" Brando took a light breath. This was the necessary procedure. Although he had never ignited the primitive flame, he knew that the remnant of the primitive flame should be a part of Martha's will. But at this moment, he felt a little different. He was certain that the person in front of him should be Martha herself. Although she was not here. "Of course, I am prepared," he answered. "Good, my child, let me ask you a few questions, okay?" A soft voice sounded in his mind. "Ha!" Brando was slightly stunned. This was not right. He knew the general steps of igniting the flame. After making an agreement with Martha, this kind goddess should have directly activated the order. But why was there an additional step now? Could it be because of the primitive flame? He had never ignited the primitive flame, so he was not sure, but at this time, it was more appropriate to follow the goddess' wishes, so he nodded. Moreover, this goddess was as gentle as a mother, it was impossible to reject her. Martha smiled. "Let me ask you, child, do you have faith in your heart?" "Faith? What do you want to live for?" This kind of thinking is a kind of faith in itself. Whether it is glory, strength, or just the desire to move forward, because there is a goal, only then can civilization move forward. At that moment, Brando thought of everyone he was familiar with in Erewhon. He thought of Freya, the Roman, the regent princess, the citizens of Bucci, and the refugees he brought from Fortress Reden. Perhaps there is. Martha placed a light crown on his head. Under the gentle white light, she gently stroked his forehead. "Child, do you understand the meaning of the crown?" The meaning of the crown. Brando thought in his heart, isn't that the symbol of the supreme royalty? But this answer was definitely wrong for Martha, because the human royalty was meaningless to her, and she did not need that kind of thing. So he shook his head. The person who wears the crown is called the king. The so-called king will always walk in front of everyone. Only in this way can he let his people see his back. However, as long as people see that back, they will become strong and have the courage to continue moving forward. So, do you understand? A king is destined to shine in heat, an existence that everyone looks up to. In the darkness, he will lead everyone to cut through the thorns, always moving forward to illuminate the endless abyss. This kind of unstoppable path is called the king's dedication. The king's dedication. Brando felt the crown the goddess placed on his head, and his heart suddenly thumped. What do you think is dedication? Dedication. Brando raised his head. In the hazy light, he could not see the goddess's appearance clearly, but the woman always looked at him with a smile, and there was an unchanging expectation in her eyes. This expectation gave him the courage to answer, word by word, in accordance with his heart. "I think, the so-called dedication, should be something that can make one feel satisfied, so that one can complete it without any complaints or regrets. Do you have such a thing to complete, my child? I think I do. Brando once again thought of Erewhon in his homeland, thinking of the palace burning in flames. The so-called uncontrollable desire to change things, perhaps this was the meaning of him coming here. The moment he saw Martha, he suddenly understood. The expectation in Martha's eyes turned into praise. She said, "So, some people are destined to be different from others, only because they always have this kind of light in their hearts, with an unyielding belief, to change this world. Regardless of whether they succeed or not, there will always be a pair of wings of light behind them, making everyone behind them feel warm. Such people are called heroes by history." Child, I'm very satisfied with your answer, so I'll give you a gift to prove that you've fulfilled your promise. The goddess suddenly said. Just as she finished speaking, a voice rang in Brendel's mind. System notification, Destiny Talent, the Chosen One, activated. Destiny Talent. Brando was once again flabbergasted. Destiny Talent. Didn't he already receive the inheritance of the Darkness Dragon? But double Destiny Talent. What the hell is this? What's going on? Is there a bug in the system? Brando felt a little numb from the blow, but he still could not help but curse in his heart, even if you're Lady Martha, you can't be so overpowered. And why is he the chosen one? Shouldn't Martha's Destiny Talent be Martha's son? The goddess seemed to have seen through his thoughts and smiled faintly. Indeed, the chosen one isn't the best talent. But it's entrusted with my hopes for you, child. Just like the ancient prophecies, I'll bestow upon you a pair of wings of light. Only then can I appoint you as king. I hope you can follow your words and actions. Then, one day, my child, I'll be glorified because of you. Glorified because of me? Brando was puzzled. But the goddess did not answer. She raised her head, and her gaze seemed to pierce through the endless void, seeing through all the darkness without a doubt. Then, a gentle smile appeared on her face. Come, let us witness this moment together, child. Light will return to the earth. She raised her hand. A boundless white light emerged from the darkness. At that moment, all the people and monsters in the loop of trade winds suddenly stopped. Every person and monster felt a faint throbbing in their hearts. As if there was some kind of opportunity, the laws of heaven and earth completely calmed down. The huge power of the demon wave was actually suppressed in an instant. This is impossible. Everyone had the same thought, but nothing was impossible. When they subconsciously turned their heads, they saw that in the darkness between heaven and earth, streaks of white light were piercing through the walls of clouds of the loop of trade winds like sharp swords. The streaks of white light pierced through the sky as if they were breaking out of a shell. The light was breaking free, the flame had been ignited. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 468. The darkness faded away. The first ray of light was like a sharp blade that split the sky. Beams of dazzling white light burst out from that dazzling gap. Compared to the surroundings, it was darker. Then, more light emerged from behind the cloud wall. Behind it, there seemed to be a huge cocoon of light. Under the illumination of the light, the sky began to turn a faint purple, then a light blue, then a grayish blue. Soon, the shadows of the trees near the green tower began to emerge from the darkness. White fog filled the forest, and the scenery became like that of dawn. It was as if a black curtain had been pulled away from the rolling hills, revealing the greenery of the forest below. The green carpet was covered with a golden glow. Then, the first ray of dawn shone on the frontline battlefield near the wall of roses, washing away the darkness that shrouded the warriors who had been slumbering here. The battlefield was silent. Countless black wolf corpses were piled up together, and the cold bodies of the tall ancient tree guards were like a group of statues that stood forever under the morning light. The first rays of dawn continued to move forward, passing through the already silent battlefield. The first rays of light fell on the trunks of the ancient trees of the Green Tower, and the shadows of the light slowly climbed up the trunks. Layer by layer, the true appearance of each battlefield was revealed from the darkness. The valiant elves had defended every corner they could, but in the end, they died of exhaustion. The intensity of the battle had exceeded the limits of both sides. Even the magical creatures were now only killing their own enemies, throwing them aside and continuing to advance. However, their advance was still blocked in front of the elven hall. After the shadows retreated, the battlefield was revealed for the first time. Behind the layers of monsters' corpses, the centaurs' and elves' defense line was on the verge of collapse, but miraculously, it held on. Almost everyone had joined the battle. Spells were intertwined on the battlefield, and the two Silver Alliance mages who stood at the back formed the most solid pillars of the defense line. The Aween citizen from the Southern Legion, Nordos, finally couldn't help but blink his eyes. His movements seemed to be frozen as he looked up with his mouth agape. He stared at the golden light rising from the back of the black wolf like a tide. He stood beside a row of tall centaur warriors with a long sword in his hand. He could not believe what he saw with his tired eyes. The gentle light was like the tide. Dawn, it was daybreak. Everyone stopped fighting, not because the battle was over, but because the black wolf's steel-like fur suddenly burst into flames. The countless terrifying monsters on the battlefield actually began to wail in pain. One after another, they were set ablaze under the light of dawn. For a moment, a sea of fire formed on the square. The white light pierced through the monster's body like a sharp sword. After burning it, it turned into ashes. Looking at such a spectacular scene, even the bravest person couldn't help but feel lucky to have survived a disaster. The terrifying attack was disintegrated in an instant and turned into ashes. What kind of power was this? But in everyone's heart, there was one thing that was beyond doubt. Looks like he did it, just as I expected. William turned his head and smiled at his companion beside him. Hee, among our Erewhon people, there's an amazing little guy. Tolman replied with a smile. My old friend, Eric, founded this country that was given hope in the darkness. I understand his belief, but this belief has been misinterpreted by his descendants for too long. I don't know if he will be able to see everything that has happened today. Perhaps someone will finally be able to raise the flag that has fallen for too long. William sighed. Yes, it's a pity that as a silver folk, you can't participate in the revival of your country. What a pity. Tolman replied. But at least you won't have to watch it fall completely, right? William's silver eyes flashed with wisdom. He smiled and said an ancient proverb, mortals start a new era. Let bygones be bygones. The two wizards from the Silver Alliance exchanged their opinions. But on the other side, the druids and elves fell into grief after a brief moment of ecstasy. The people standing here survived, but more people left forever. Everyone lost at least one or a few family members. Even the wood elves, who lived a long life and did not show their emotions too much, could not help but sob softly. The square was infected with a layer of sadness. Notice and a group of centaur warriors stood at the side and watched the elves hug each other and cry. The warriors' emotions were stronger. Moreover, the war with Madara had made him used to the separation of life and death. But for some reason, he could not help but feel a little heavy in his heart. I think I can understand their feelings, a tall centaur warrior said. He was the leader of these centaurs. Battle should bring glory to people, but this kind of battle can only bring sorrow and loss. Notice nodded. But was Erewhon's battle not the same? That ancient kingdom might not be able to give them an answer. He looked at these people and suddenly had a realization. The flame seed was finally ignited. When Brando's hands left the huge crystal prism, a continuous stream of stronger light was lit up from the crystal. The flawless white light shone on every corner of the underground hall. A huge, mysterious hall made up of more than 100 pillars appeared in front of everyone. At this moment, no one noticed this because everyone looked up at the crystal in the sky with a sacred look. A pure white flame burned in the crystal, like a sacred fire, but in fact, it was the holy book of the law woven by order. It restrained all things in silence, elements and magic floating under the sea of chaos, Martha's order. An extremely calm aura spread from the crystal. Everyone felt their bodies tighten, and the weak magic in their bodies and the faint connection between the great mana tide and the weak magic in their bodies was cut off. Brando was slightly surprised. He found that the primitive flame seed's function was somewhat different from ordinary flame seeds. The flame seeds made by the wizards directly rearranged the law, but Martha's flame seed first cut off all the power of the source, magic, wandering power, and even the elemental power in the law were completely cut off. It was like a formatting program, first clearing all the remnants in the area, then writing the law on a clean white paper. This law must include a law to introduce power. After the law was completely completed, the power needed to build the world would be introduced within the law's allowed range. The benefits of this were obvious. Because the foundation was clean, the flame seed's protection was also very stable, and it was the most difficult to be affected by the Chaos Sea's magic tide. However, it was not without its disadvantages. At least in the process of formatting, everyone's power was completely suppressed, and even their physical strength was only slightly stronger than ordinary people. Fortunately, this process was only temporary. He estimated that it would take about a week at most. At the same time, the process of formatting targeted all the creatures in every inch of the illuminated area of the flame of order. The suppression on the monsters was even stronger, so he was not worried about any danger. At most, he was not used to it. The will of the goddess had already left. When he turned around, he saw Mephisto and Scarlet looking at the side of the hall. There were a few footsteps coming from that direction. Brendel frowned. The only other person left in the loop of trade winds was Veronica. Of course, he did not rule out the possibility of there being natives, but the possibility of that was low. After a while, Veronica and Farina appeared in that direction. Andesha was still following behind them with a hateful expression. Veronica had followed the source of the light to find them. She obviously did not expect Brendel to be here, and she was shocked when she saw them. However, the lighthouse soon attracted the attention of the Empire's goddess of war. This is the primordial kindling. Like Mephistopheles, she also had a solemn look on her face. Is this the legendary gift that the goddess left for the mortals? I've only seen it once in Maris from afar. Maris was in the territory of the Templar Church. There was a well-preserved temple of Martha that stored the flame seed. It was said that the flame seed was the foundation of the guardian land of Cruz, Farndos. The power of the fire seed was so strong that there had not been any rumors of magic beasts for hundreds of years. It was for this reason that the holy city of Maris and the surrounding cities had become the largest and most prosperous cities on the continent. Brendel understood Veronica's words, but Andesha's reaction was completely different from Veronica's. Her prismatic purple pupils suddenly shrank, and she cried out involuntarily, "The flame seed?" As a matter of fact, the half-human, half-monster woman had also recognized the true identity of the lighthouse. When it came to knowledge, she was much more knowledgeable than everyone present. After all, Brendel was considered a cheat, so it was not counted. Andesha was now in a strange situation. The flame seed's deterrence was too great, and it meant a new, vast territory ruled by order. If they were nurtured well, it was not impossible for a few new empires to be born from this territory, even as powerful as the current Kurlutz Empire. Wasn't the flame seed of Maris a ready-made proof? A dangerous glint flashed in the woman's eyes. She couldn't help but want to stake everything on this. If she succeeded, it meant that the tree herders would have one or two less enemies in the future. Especially the new empires, which were the most dangerous enemies, not to mention the countless smaller kingdoms and duchies that depended on them. Andesha, what are you trying to do? Veronica had already sensed that something was wrong with this captive. Andesha did not say a word, and she was already in a battle stance. Even though she was heavily injured, the pressure in front of her was too great. When Mephisto and Veronica saw this, they immediately drew their weapons and prepared to defend themselves. Andesha, do you want to die? Brando frowned when he saw this scene. He did not expect Andesha to have such a strong reaction to the flame seed. Hee, little one, it's not like I don't have a chance. Andesha licked her lips. Even though she was in a frenzy, she did not lose her rationality. Under the suppression of the flame seed, we can only display the strength of our race. Even though half of my body is a monster and the restrictions are stronger, as a high-level monster, my innate advantage is much stronger than the few of you weak humans. 1 against 3, it's not like I don't have a chance. She replied with a hoarse voice. Everyone's heart tightened when they heard this. They knew that the flame seed had an innate ability to suppress monsters, but they forgot that Andesha was an extraordinary existence in the loop of trade winds. She was originally a human, and even though she was later transformed into a monster, half of her body was still recognized by Martha. If a fight really broke out, it was just as Andesha had said, they would not be able to gain any benefits. Brando could not help but suck in a breath of cold air and drew Halran Gaia. Originally, he was the weakest among the three, but because he was an elite, his race's strength was stronger. If Andesha insisted on going crazy, he could only accompany her. But at this time, something happened that caught everyone off guard. Before Andesha could finish her words, a golden figure appeared in front of her in a flash, and a muffled sound rang out. It was like a heavy punch had struck flesh. The half-human half-monster woman was sent flying, and the latter half of her sentence came to an abrupt end. What replaced it was a blood-curdling scream. Then, it crashed into a huge pillar and smashed it into pieces. Gold-ranked strength, such a thought flashed through everyone's mind. Who was this person who could maintain gold-tier strength under the suppression of the primordial fire seed? But Andesha, who had experienced this power firsthand, had a deeper understanding of it. She shrieked in terror, "Dragon race, this is impossible." Dragon. Brando's first thought was that the prideful female dragon had followed them. But that little girl clearly said that she would be leaving for a period of time. Even if she came back after finishing her business, it was impossible for her to come to the loop of trade winds so quickly. Unless she had followed them before they entered the Black Forest. But in terms of time, it was impossible. Thinking of this, he could not help but suck in a deep breath. He focused his gaze and fell into a daze. What he saw was not a female dragon, but Scarlet. What is going on? Brando felt like his brain had stopped working. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 469. The 4 seasons in the Black Forest changed drastically, but in the barony of Abes, the harsh winter of the Year of the Sword had just passed, and there was no sign of the temperature rising. There were 2 heavy snowfalls before and after the slumbering moon, but it seemed to indicate the first harvest of the territory. The streets were still cold, and there were few pedestrians. But in the only bar in the city, it was a different scene. The fireplace warmed the hall, and the adventurers who had been wandering around Abes since the end of summer had gathered here, waiting for the ice and snow in the forest to melt. Every adventurer who entered the inn would take off their snow-covered cloaks and observe the entire hall. Without exception, they would take off their hats and pay their respects to a little girl sitting in the corner of the hall from afar. The little girl had a high forehead, and it was as smooth as jade. It sparkled under the firelight, and her eyes were big and bright. She seemed to be curious about the people and things around her. She was wearing a beautiful dress. Although she wasn't too old, her chest had already begun to develop. The dress was tucked in at the waist, perfectly accentuating the young lady's slender figure. However, the dress, which was full of the temperament of a noble lady, didn't match her. Instead, it looked a little sneaky, as if she was wearing a dress that was stolen from somewhere. "Boss, this is the deerskin you wanted. The forest is completely frozen, and it took us a lot of effort to track down a herd of deer. Harto is also a little frostbitten, so you can't be too stingy with the reward." A few people dressed as hunters stood in front of her and negotiated. The leader was obviously a mountain man from the nearby area. He wore a thick leather coat and carried a longbow on his back. "Oh, Harto is frostbitten. Then he's really unlucky." The Roman blinked and asked curiously, "Are there no more deer in the forest?" "It's all because of those subterranean dwellers. They scared the animals and made them hide." "Hey, I heard that the subterranean dwellers stopped before it snowed." "Well. Anyway, it has something to do with it. I want to make a coat for Brando with these deerskins. I'll pay you 200 silver coins, okay?" The Roman poked the deerskin with her finger and asked. "Of course, we're happy to make a coat for His Excellency. This way, His Excellency will definitely like you more, big sister." The person who spoke had a look of disbelief on his face as if he didn't believe that the young lady in front of him could make a coat, but he still said respectfully, "But this is too little, big sister. Harto is frostbitten. But this is obviously from last year. Look, some parts of it are eaten by worms." The merchant lady looked innocent as she flipped the deerskin. "Aw." The great merchant made these guys speechless with just one sentence. The adventurers immediately looked embarrassed as they coughed and said, "The year isn't that important. Besides, we really went to the forest, and Harto was really frostbitten. So, these deerskins aren't worth that much money. You know that. The rest of the money is for Harto's medicine. Don't turn around and lose it to that gambler Mano. Tomorrow, I'll send someone to visit Harto." She glared at them. "If he doesn't receive the money, I'll send the subterranean dwellers to eat you." After being scolded, the hunters obediently took the money and left. Although they didn't cheat the merchant lady, they didn't show much dissatisfaction on their faces. It was as if they were used to this kind of bargaining. On the other hand, the Roman restlessly touched the round-toed leather shoes under her long skirt. Her pair of big eyes rolled around as if they never stopped. She looked around, holding a cup of steaming barley beer as if she was waiting for someone. For the whole winter, the self-proclaimed merchant lady had been sitting in this position, doing business or buying people's hearts. But there was a reason why she was respected here. It wasn't just because she was the fiancée of the Lord, or because she was in charge of half of the territory's wealth. She was like the god of wealth in everyone's eyes. It was because she was amiable and would never use her identity to pressure people. She was even willing to argue with the adventurers for the whole afternoon over the difference of a few copper coins. But it was precisely because of this that people didn't feel the difference between their identities. Adventurers didn't live a rich life. Money was a very important thing. In fact, they didn't think highly of those who squandered money. Among all of Brando's companions and aides, only the Roman and Freya could understand this. Freya's preference was due to her family background, while Roman's preference was due to his instincts towards those shiny little things. After a winter, she had interacted with many adventurers in ABs and had integrated into them. Although this kind of contact was not close, it was enough for the Roman to find out a lot of information that she didn't know before. At this time, the door of the bar was once again pushed open, and there was a moment of silence. The little silver elf Princess Medisha stood in the snow. She was wearing a plain silver fur shawl. She covered her mouth with both hands and exhaled. Her big eyes were a little nervous as she looked at the crowded hall. Humans were a little strange in her eyes. The elves didn't like to gather so many people together. The elves' definition of friends was a kind of spiritual attachment. Because of the long time, this kind of feeling was somewhat indifferent in the eyes of humans. But this wasn't the first time she came here. She was here to help the Lord's servant, the Shire, pass on a message. When the other people in the bar saw the little silver elf princess, they tacitly made a path for her. The first time someone teased her, the little girl with pointy ears almost turned red. As a result, the rumor of the Lord's shy second fiancé spread. When she thought of this, Medisha couldn't help but stare at the Roman. Medisha, do you want ale? No. Fruit wine? No. Then I'll heat up a cup of honey wine for you, okay? No. Medisha knew that the Roman didn't drink himself. She held a cup of warm ale purely because it was warm. And this guy was stingy to the point that he was unwilling to change a cup. When it turned cold, he would heat it up again. If it was possible, he would definitely do it again the next day. But perhaps it was because of this stingy guy that he was able to arrange all the expenses and income of the territory so neatly. Anyway, Medisha felt a headache when she saw the piles of gold and silver coins that were meaningless to her. The territory gradually got on the right track. The coins from the silver mines were continuously sent to the Roman, and the merchant lady distributed the money to the refugees. Of course, this wasn't a charity event. Instead, it was the first time in half a century that ABs had opened up a large amount of wasteland in the forest north of the Gree River. The winter wheat seeds had been sown and were sleeping under the snow. When the snow melted, they would break out of the ground at any time. The Shire and the master craftsmen discussed taking in more refugees from the north. The construction of the road in the dark forest was slowly progressing. The population of ABs wasn't large. Even if they counted the residents from Port Gree and Minsk Fort, it was still far from enough to meet the needs. Not to mention the lack of manpower for the White Lion Legion, even the construction workers of the Rune Dwarf Odom couldn't spare a single bit of manpower. Food was the foundation of this plan. But the merchant lady's maturity and calmness in this matter exceeded everyone's expectations. Just like the Shire said, she seemed to have a natural talent in the field of ecology. This was an innate leadership style that allowed her to arrange everything calmly and orderly. The food from Ampere Seal had already been shipped here, but the Roman didn't distribute it directly. Instead, they handed it over to the merchants and used this method to recover the money that had been distributed before. And so, after many years, the food market was re-established in ABs in the winter of this year. Ever since the short-sighted Grodin took it all for himself. The Roman had already begun to consider lowering the remuneration for the next recruitment. Brando needed more people, so she had to act like this. The problem of food wasn't a problem at all. As long as the gold in ABs shone brightly, the merchants of Ampere Seal would swarm over like sharks that smelled blood. In fact, they were already here. The first merchant fleet wasn't large, but the food and daily necessities were being unloaded at Port Gree. It didn't matter, there would be more and more. The gold attracted not only merchants, but also refugees from other territories. The taste of freely circulating money was even sweeter than cake. This was what her aunt had said before, and the merchant girl was very sure of it. She put away the report that Medisha had passed to the Shire and asked with wide eyes, "Where's Brando, Medisha? My lord hasn't returned yet. Then I want to talk to him." No. Medisha immediately refused. It wasn't the first time the Roman had used her as a mouthpiece. She immediately explained, "Ever since my lord entered the loop of trade winds, my communication with him seems to have been cut off." The Roman let out a long, disappointed sigh. "Does that fellow from the Shire have anything else to say?" "Well, he just wants to ask you what you're planning to do after spending so much money on hiring adventurers to complete strange missions." The silver elf princess glanced at the pile of deerskins on the table and couldn't help but wonder if this fellow was just doing it for fun. However, this thought only flashed through the merchant girl's mind. As a fairy princess, Medicia's concept of wealth was very weak. If Scarlet or the more serious Freya were here, they would probably stare at this young lady with a suspicious look. Ah, the Roman was just about to say that. The merchant girl showed a surprised expression. There are no more deers in the forest. Do you know why, Medicia? As an elven royal who came from before the War of the Holy Saints and was trained as a silver elf commander, Medicia's face became serious when she heard the Roman's words. The animals in the forest wouldn't disappear for no reason. This could only mean one thing: the other party had already started to make a move. She couldn't help but look at the Roman and realized that he was asking for information. What else do you know, Roman? Many adventurers have mentioned that the undead in the vicinity have become more active recently. I think that those bad guys from Butchie have arrived. Brando said that they're nearby, right? Madara. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 470. Madara had arrived. Not only that, Count Randner was able to gather an army of 20,000 men in just a month or two. This included the Knight of Paulus and 3 other Knight Lords, as well as the Highlanders and Barbarians. Such a large force did not seem like it was just to quell the rebellion, but to show off to those who dared to mock him. Such mobilization ability meant that Count Randner was far from retiring. Before this, he was like a tiger with squinting eyes. Once he opened his eyes wide in anger, the entire forest would tremble, just like decades ago. Now, the whole of Tonajul was under the control of this tiger. Most of the remaining people were already gloating over the fate of those who dared to touch the tiger's whiskers. The captain of Griffin's Night Guard, Viscount Assel, immediately left his office and walked towards the princess's study after receiving the report. Sir Cop saw this scene and followed behind him. Hey, Captain Knight, I heard the news from the south. Cop's position in the royal faction was not high, but he was on Grandmaster Fleetwood's side. Fleetwood was the princess's teacher, and at the same time, he was also the chief court mage of Aween. His position in the royal faction was revered, and even the leaders of the faction had to lower their heads in front of him. Assel did not want to provoke Fleetwood, so he nodded. Her Highness thinks highly of the rebels, but unfortunately, she will be disappointed this time. In fact, the lords above are not very supportive of making contact with the rebels. It is too risky. After all, Count Randner is a duke. The princess isn't willing to negotiate with Duke Arek. Sigh, she's still a child after all. No matter how wise people make her out to be, a woman is still a woman. It's inevitable for her to have some naive wishes. Cop nodded and pretended to sigh. Assel looked at him and replied, "Politics is politics. The future of the kingdom is more important than anything else. I believe that Her Highness will see this point clearly in the end. Reaching an agreement with Count Randner is the best choice for us. Only then will Her Highness have enough weight to negotiate with Arek." That's right, but I'm worried that Her Highness won't come to her senses. Did you know, Lord Assel? I heard that she has secretly contacted the rebels. If Count Randner gets hold of this evidence, we will be in a passive position. Don't worry, Master Fleetwood, Duke Anthony doesn't agree to continue secretly supporting those country bumpkins. The Knight Order has also expressed the same intention. Coupled with the current situation, Her Highness won't be stubborn. The Knight Captain replied. Hearing this, Cope snickered, thinking that the princess was much more stubborn than the rumors made her out to be. Besides, it wasn't as if no one supported her. However, he was a tactful person and would not say anything directly. Instead, he cleverly asked, "What about Lord Oberway?" Acer fell silent. Indeed, the guy called Wolf had always been ambiguous, making it hard for others to understand his thoughts. What was even more troublesome was that Oberway was the leader of the faction with real power. In terms of intelligence, he wasn't inferior to the cunning fox Makarov. It was because of this person's silence that the voices around the princess could not reach a consensus. As long as the voices did not reach a consensus, it meant that there were variables. However, Acer did not think highly of the rebels. In his opinion, placing the fate of the kingdom in a gamble was akin to child's play. Cope also had the same thoughts. In fact, most of the people in the royal faction had similar thoughts. In their eyes, Count Randner, who held real power in his hands, was much more reliable than a bunch of rebels who had no backing at all. In fact, he was much more amiable. As for Princess Griffin's plan, it was somewhat feasible. However, it was a little too risky. In the eyes of the nobles, the so-called confidence was just a naive idea of a young girl who pursued the so-called control of her own destiny. They had seen this kind of behavior too many times and no longer cared about it. Instead, they had a look of pity and understanding. The fate of the princess was to be used for political marriage. Since the little girl wanted to struggle, they would let her do it as long as it did not affect the overall situation. Acer gestured to Cope to leave and pushed open the wooden door of the princess's study. There were many people in the study. He looked up and saw Oberway, Fleetwood, Makarov, and the Violet Count Ball. Almost all the core members of the royal faction were gathered here. The captain of the night did not find it strange. In fact, ever since the situation in the south became tense, there had been meetings here almost every day. However, the atmosphere in the room was a little oppressive, to the point that it was abnormal. Under such circumstances, Viscount Assel had no choice but to submit the new information under everyone's watchful eyes. "Thank you, Lord Acer." The princess's clear voice was very calm, but for some reason, Acer felt a little guilty at this moment. In fact, Fleetwood was the princess's teacher, but he could be considered half of it. The princess's outstanding swordsmanship was taught by him. "This is my duty, Your Highness." Acer lowered his head and replied. He saw that Princess Griffin and the others were not in the mood to read the report, and he understood that everyone present had already heard the news. He couldn't help but raise his head to look at the incomparably calm half-elf princess. Today, Princess Griffin was as calm as ever. Her beauty seemed to seep out from this temperament, making people's hearts palpitate. However, the princess was unusually quiet. Her silver hair reflected the candlelight and formed a hazy halo. She placed her hands on her slender knees and pursed her lips. She faced the gazes of everyone present without flinching. "I understand," she replied, "as Your Excellency's wish." Even though it was a compromise, her voice was firm and there was no room for retreat. It was as if even this was the decision she had made herself. Seeing this scene, even Count Ball could not help but shake his head. How good would it be if the princess was a prince? However, there were no ifs in history. Compromising with Count Randner and marrying Erek was imperative. In the hearts of the members of the royal faction, the northern barbarians were nothing but chickens and dogs. Once the snow melted, the war between the north and the south would decide their future. The revival of the kingdom seemed to be unstoppable. It was a perfect outcome. Achoo! Hatch sneezed. He rubbed his face to prevent the cold air from freezing his face. Even though the new year had passed, winter showed no signs of ending. Instead, it was getting colder. To the north of the Gree River, the wooden walls of the small outposts in the forest were covered with a layer of icicles. The wood was frozen to the point that it was no different from rocks. Hatch placed his gloves on the parapet wall and looked at the forest from the observation tower. There were originally barren lands in the forest, but they had not been planted since winter. The mercenaries had crossed the river before winter, and the only ones left were soldiers like him. Soldiers, mercenaries, soldiers in the castle, guards, and knight. All of them were professional soldiers from various places. Many people who were not too far away from Trondheim already knew about the upcoming war, but in their eyes, there was no suspense in this battle. Even though Count Ragnar was getting old, he was still full of vigor and vitality. His orders were still regarded as authoritative in the areas under his rule, and he was able to gather an army of 10,000 to 20,000 soldiers in a short period of time. Furthermore, everyone knew that Count Ragnar had the support of the undead and the barbarians. Even the dukes in the north did not dare to underestimate such a force. However, Hatch's view was different. Just before today, there were soldiers from different places entering this small outpost for 3 consecutive days. 4 came in 3 days, 6 came in the morning of the second day, and 7 came in yesterday. In just 3 days, the number of soldiers in this outpost had reached 20. All of them were professional soldiers. This conclusion shocked Hatch himself. Before he joined the new lord, he was Grodin's knight. Of course, he could not be compared to the guards in the castle, but Grodin did not have more than 50 soldiers who were as experienced as him. The rest were mostly the nobles' private soldiers or even the militia. They were there to make up the numbers. Hatch had experienced several battles between lords. In this era, the battles between lords were often bloody. Even though the nobles were not really hurt, except for those who were unlucky enough to be hit by stray arrows, their private soldiers and knights' consumption was very high. Only those who had survived a battle could be called a skilled warrior. And for someone like him who had experienced several battles, he simply looked down on those who couldn't even hold a sword. It was useless no matter how many of them there were. However, a lord would only have around 100 or so knights under him that he could truly rely on, and not more. First of all, he could not afford to raise them. A professional soldier required a lot of resources, let alone a seasoned knight. Secondly, there were not many outstanding talents. The attractiveness of a small lord was not as great as the heroes of a region. Any knight with a little bit of strength would go to a lord like Count Ragnar. For example, a baron like Grodin only had around 100 men under his command, which meant that he was a very powerful lord. Even a baron like Grodin only had around 100 men under his command. However, Brando was an exception. This was because all the people under him were gathered by chance. They were mercenaries from the mountain people and even from further places. Although these mercenaries had not experienced any real war, they had been through bloody battles all year round. Those who could survive were often sharper than the average soldier in terms of combat. The mercenaries under Jutta, Rabin, and Cornelius were even more outstanding. Rabin's men were originally Erwin's cavalrymen who came from the Karansu highlands. They were originally elite scouts, and after being baptized by blood and fire, their individual strength was stronger than the other mercenaries. However, they were not the strongest because there was also the existence of the Copper Dragon Redos group. Their strength was not high, and the most outstanding one was only at the peak of Iron ranked. However, their combat experience was unbelievably rich. Brando had long suspected their identities. Especially with Redo's identity, he suspected that these veterans were veterans of the November War. This conclusion was a little scary, but it seemed to be the most reliable guess. These experienced mercenaries made up 2/3 of Brando's human subordinates. There were also some original guards from Bucci, Fortress Reden, and the patrolling cavalrymen who had also fought against Madara. The last part was Lord Maxon's knight who followed Carglass and joined the new recruits. Brando now had close to 3,000 human soldiers under him, but more than 80% of them were true veterans. They were the most experienced soldiers who were not inferior to the official knight who had been training for years. Outsiders thought that the Tonajol rebels were just a motley crew of 2,000 to 3,000, but Hatch knew that the young lord had more than 2,000 knight subordinates. More than 2,000 knight, Martha above, could lead an army of 100,000 knight. When the late King Eric founded the kingdom, he only had 200 knight followers. there's movement in the forest. Suddenly, a voice spoke from behind him. Hatch was startled and turned around subconsciously. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 471. Brendel, who was in the center of the loop of trade winds, naturally did not know about Count Randner's army. In fact, he was in a state of shock with Veronica and the others. Andesha's physical strength was several times stronger than a normal human's. Her physical strength alone was at the level of an early silver rank, but it did not help her gain the slightest advantage over Scarlet. The battle ended quickly, and under Brando's orders, Andesha was knocked unconscious with a single blow. But what was going on? The girl walked out of the fog. Her face was as red as an apple, but she did not even need to take a deep breath. Brando looked at the girl who had a long red ponytail and sharp canine teeth when she gritted her teeth. He could not help but ask, "Scarlet, are you all right?" Scarlet quickly shook her head. "I'm not sure, my lord. I just felt that my physical strength was not suppressed much after I ignited the fire seed." "How strong is your body right now?" "According to what my lord said, I should be at the peak of silver rank." Peak of silver rank. Not only Brando, but even Veronica could not help but gasp. Generally speaking, even at Mephisto's and her level of strength, their pure physical strength would only be at the level of an iron rank. Strength, agility, and vitality were usually increased by the amount of energy stored in the body. These energies were converted from elemental and mana, and were not part of the body itself. Elemental activation was to test the type of power one could extract from the entire world, and gradually discover the nature and rules of this power from one's own power. Only when one's understanding of a rule had reached the limit could one truly absorb and contain this rule. This was the perfect physique. A perfect physique was the final process of fusing the energy contained in the body with oneself. That was why the Golden Race's greatest advantage was that once they fully comprehended an elemental domain, their bodies would be perfect. For example, the Dragon Race would directly obtain a golden body, and then directly advance to the level of existence from this foundation. The Galba Wizards and Silver Elves, as the Silver Race, would start with a silver body once they surpassed their elemental domain. They were only second to the Golden Race. As for the other races that were lost in the land, whether it was the Eruin, Cruz, or Saint Tossol Wind Elves, even though they boasted that they were Martha's favorites, they had no choice but to start from the most basic iron body to the peak. Indeed, the path of humans was endless and full of plasticity. The Golden Race's life and strength growth was extremely long, and it often took more than a few hundred years to reach the peak of elemental domain. The Silver Race was second, but they were still inferior to the Elves. The record for the fastest growth in power among the humans was held by Gretel, the former ruler of the Kurlutz people. He had reached the peak of elemental energy at the age of 70. The record for the dwarves was 160 years old, and the Wind Elves were 210 years old. They were all much younger than the most outstanding geniuses of the gold or silver folk. "It's not a real dragon," Mephisto said at this time, and Brando nodded. A real dragon's bloodline was the Golden Race, and Scarlet's body was only at the peak of silver. It was likely that her body contained a part of the dragon's bloodline. This kind of thing was very common in the human world. Some dragons like to take the form of humans and leave their descendants in the human world. For example, the little female dragon, when she first met Brando, she also took the form of a human girl. There was even a legend about this in the Tower of Stars and Moon. It is said that the dragon chooses its mate in May every 10 years. The astrologers of the Tower of 10 Realms claim that the first baby born in this month will have the blood of the dragon flowing in his veins. The Tower of 10 Realms was located in the southeast of Saint Tossol, in the Cloudwall Mountains. It was the edge of the endless black forest in the east, and there were often rumors of travelers seeing dragons. Scarlet, Who are your parents? Brando asked. Scarlet was startled, and suddenly understood what the Lord wanted to ask. She quickly shook her head and said, My lord, my parents are just ordinary Highlanders. Do you remember clearly? Yes, I still remember some things when I was young. I am the biological daughter of my parents. My father said that I look more like my mother, and I also have an older brother. She seemed to be afraid that Brando would not believe her, so she added, But the village was robbed, and I was saved by the leader. I'm sorry. Brando did not expect to make her recall two painful memories at once, and he could not help but feel a little guilty. Yes, it's nothing. Scarlet shook her head and smiled, revealing her sharp canine teeth. Brando was almost stunned by this smile. In his mind, Scarlet rarely smiled, but he did not expect her to look so beautiful when she smiled. He could not help but cry out in his heart, but at the same time, a trace of doubt rose in his heart. If Scarlet's bloodline did not come from her parents, then where did it come from? Unless Andesha saw wrongly, but with that woman's knowledge, she would not make such a mistake. Furthermore, monsters were naturally sensitive to the aura of dragons, so this inference was overturned from the start. Is it because of the blood of God? Orthless was also puzzled. She had never heard of iron men mutating into golden bloodline. That's not right. Brando shook his head. The blood of God could only turn people into divine envoys, but it could not turn people into golden folk. My lord, look at this. Sure, Scarlet raised her hands, and Brando saw dark golden runes faintly flowing on her arms. This scene was familiar. Before the arrival of the demonic wave, there was a similar sign on her body, but he did not pay much attention to it at that time. He only thought that it was due to the large amount of mana flowing through her veins after absorbing the golden apple, and it resonated with the demonic wave. But now, it seemed that this was not the case. Now that the mana had been completely cut off by Martha's Law, the runes still remained on her body. This meant that it was not mana, but the power of the blood of God. Brando frowned. He did not know much about bloodlines, so he did not recognize these strange runes. But Orthless could not help but whisper, solidified dragon's blood. What's going on? Brando immediately asked. This girl has drunk dragon's blood, and it's the golden blood of a living dragon. She now has at least half a dragon's strength. Half a dragon's strength is not the power of the blood of God, but it is still beneficial to the host. Her current strength is at least at the peak of gold, and her absolute strength is stronger than yours. More importantly, the dragon's blood is very beneficial to her future growth. It can increase the speed of her training by at least 20 to 30%. Orthless replied. Increase the speed of her training by at least 20 to 30%. Brando almost coughed. He could see that the dragon's blood was equivalent to a natural ability. This ability was often obtained through quests in the game. However, he had never seen an ability that could increase the experience gained by 20 to 30%. He had drunk a lot of dragon's blood in the game in the past. It was in small tubes and sold by players for hundreds to tens of thousands of tor. Dragon's blood could temporarily strengthen the body's attributes, and it was an important alchemy ingredient. It was a pity that he had never heard of a natural ability from drinking dragon's blood. 20 to 30% extra experience. Brando wanted to bang his head against a wall. But when he heard the word host, he reacted and asked cautiously, There won't be any harm, right? There won't be any harm, but because of the dragon's blood in the host's body, the host will have an inexplicable sense of closeness to the owner of the dragon's blood. Orthless looked at him with a half-smile. You have a lot of enemies now, and this little girl will be a great help to you. But you have to be careful. If this dragon is an extraordinarily handsome dragon, this little girl who is so loyal to you may be kidnapped by a giant dragon from the sky one day. Hearing this, Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry, but he was not worried. He was now sure that the little female dragon had done something to the golden apple. But wait, the host will have an inexplicable sense of closeness to the owner of the dragon's blood. Brando suddenly remembered that the little female dragon named Arnaz wanted to let him eat the apple. Damn, that little girl is really up to no good. Brando cursed in his heart. He could not help but rejoice that Scarlet was the one who ate the apple. Being favored by a dragon was not necessarily a good thing. At least he had seen with his own eyes many people who were favored by a dragon and then met with bad luck. You have to know that the dragon's way of dealing with problems was usually simple and direct. They would usually directly cast a charm spell on the player or character they favored, and then directly drag them into the cave. Of course, the player would not actually be charmed. So the effect of the charm spell on the player was to receive a quest notification: a dragon has expressed interest in you, and now it has cast a spell on you to take you away. You can choose not to accept it, but it will still take you away, dead or alive. So now you have a choice, to accept or not to accept. So most of the players with normal intelligence would choose the former. Of course, a dragon would not take you into its lair to do all kinds of things that the masses would like to see, but to make it happy. The most common way was to tell it a story or solve riddles. Generally speaking, it would take 3 days and 3 nights. Of course, the player could go online and offline during that time, but in the end, the player would have to complete the quest for 72 hours or even longer to complete it. This type of quest usually had generous rewards, but not many people were willing to encounter it because it was really too complicated. The dragon's memory was very good. If you repeatedly told her the same story in these 3 days, she would definitely let you know how terrifying the wisdom of a dragon was. Brando suddenly felt a chill down his spine. He realized that Arnaz had given him a golden apple instead of a charm spell. This meant that her interest in him was definitely extraordinary. And the little female dragon did not leave because she lost interest, but because she had something more important to do. In fact, if a woman said to a man that she was interested in him, it most likely meant that the opposite sex had the intention to be with him. But the dragon's thinking was completely different. If a little female dragon said to you that she was very interested in you, then she would most likely say, "Mortal, as a toy, you make me very satisfied." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 472. What is this? Farina suddenly asked. She lifted her skirt with one hand and stood on top of the black pyramid. The pale light reflected the fine hairs on the girl's face. Next to her hand was a staff, a black metal staff about the thickness of an arm. It was inserted in the area opposite the base of the huge crystal, and a transparent crystal ball was placed on top of it. Brendel was certain that this thing did not exist in that place before. He patted Scarlet's hand. He and Orthlis had already guessed the girl's problem. As long as the dragon's blood was not harmful, they could put it aside for the time being. The threat of the dragon girl Arnaz was still a little weak. He and the others walked over to take a look at the staff. The staff was black, and there were golden patterns engraved on it. They looked like meaningless metal threads. The style of the staff was exactly the same as the hole. It had an ancient feel to it. The crystal ball was firmly attached to the staff, and it could not be removed no matter how hard he tried. Brando's strength was equivalent to 7 or 8 adults combined, and it did not budge even after he tried. This meant that the crystal ball and the staff were not connected by physical means. There might be magic at work below. Brando had a guess as soon as he saw it. He looked at the others and placed his hand on the crystal ball. In an instant, layers of green light weaved in front of him. These webs scanned up and down in an area of about a cubic meter in front of him, forming a mysterious pattern. So it's this thing. Brando's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Veronica asked. It's the core of this dungeon, Brando replied. Oh, so it's the core crystal. The Wind Elves' Ashen City Fortress also has a similar crystal. It was made by the Wizards of Bugha, and it can be used to control the outer defense system. Valkyrie suddenly understood. Brando knew about the crystal in Ashen City Fortress, but it was just a replica of the core crystal. The craftsmen of Bugha made many of these replicas, and they sold them to the players for 10,000 gold coins, about 1,000,000 tor, each. However, the replicas were far inferior to the real thing. A row of ancient characters intertwined in front of Brando and formed Staku, Doas. Roots. External sanctum, request, interrupted, damaged, Dumku, Doas. Roots. Dawn, cavalry, sanctum, request, interrupt, pos ssa, Doas. Roots. Market, requesting, interrupt. The ancient language was extremely complex. These pictophonetic characters were extremely prosperous about 20,000 years ago. It seemed to have suddenly exploded at a certain time and spread throughout the entire continent. However, that era had long been buried under the sand, and Brando could only read these words with great difficulty. This was also due to the fact that he had seen too many ancient words before he transmigrated. The ancient characters in the Amber Sword were all self-contained, and they used to be called a miracle. Many players had done research on this. In the game, there were documents in the libraries of the larger empires. There was also a systematic archaeological investigation of ancient history and writing. Such a huge and complicated world background was something they used to talk about the most. However, as the characters became more and more complex, countless characters formed a green stream of light that fell like a waterfall in Brando's eyes. However, unlike before, everyone could now see the green light web intertwined on the crystal ball. Except for the symbols that they could hardly recognize, the light web quickly formed layers of patterns under Brando's instructions. This is the panoramic view of the underground city. When the layers of green light stabilized, Veronica's eyes flashed with a strange light. The image projected by the crystal was the panoramic view of the underground city. On top, they could see the 3 layers of defense that were distributed like broken glass, and then below, the city was distributed like a spider web. The underground halls of various sizes were 3-dimensional in mid-air, and it looked like a map of the galaxy. She couldn't help but turn around and look at Brando with her green eyes. This is the panoramic view of the city. Could it be that this central crystal can control the entire city? Brando took a deep breath and nodded. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel a little surprised and excited, but not because of what Veronica said. The ancient central crystal was the core and brain of the city, and as a player, it was basic knowledge. He was surprised because of the knowledge he gained from the words. So this was the reason why Valhalla was called a legendary territory. After reading the ancient text information, although it was not complete and incomplete, and he couldn't read all of it, Brando couldn't help but tremble with excitement. Valhalla was actually a concept territory. He didn't know how the ancient silver folk came up with the idea of building such a fortress. They actually set up a huge permanent magic system with the entire city as the foundation. A permanent magic system was different from a magic circle. This was a super complicated law, elements, and magic intertwined. In fact, it was a territory, a self-contained system within the space, and it was not affected by external forces. Unless the city was completely destroyed and turned into ashes, the system would continue to operate. This permanent magic system seemed to be a kind of spirit communication technique, but it was much higher level than that. The Valhalla people used a permanent transformation system to preserve their souls, gathering heroic spirits from all over the world into this fortress. It was used to preserve skills, technology, and soldiers that might have been lost in the river of time. In short, Valhalla was simply an ancient technology and information center. Brando saw the purgatory people who worshipped the sun and fire among these heroic spirits, as well as the mist elves and the legendary light folk. He saw the Dawn Spear Cavalry Temple, which was where the heroic spirits of the temple raised the purgatory people who worshipped the flames of the sun, the Dawn Spear Cavalry. The purgatory people were the legendary golden race. The Dawn Spear Cavalry could use the light of dawn to defend against enemies of darkness, and they had powerful healing spells, but this soldier class had already disappeared in the war between the purgatory people and the Twilight Dragon. Even the purgatory people themselves had disappeared in history. But he never thought that the Valhalla people would reappear in this martyr's temple. Although he didn't know how high the standard of the genuine Dawn Spear Cavalry was, the genuine Dawn Spear Cavalry was a level 10 soldier class. Even if it was a medium-sized empire, it could become the main force of the main forces. Other than that, he also saw the Twilight Altar that recruited sudden death angels and the Eternal Dark Forest that recruited dark elf archers. These two were legendary level 14 peak super armies. Even normal empires might not have them. Brando knew that other than those superpowers that spanned the continent, there were only the 4 empires established by the 4 sages that had this level of army. The ancient powerful warriors were all gathered here. This was the original intention of the Martyr's Temple. No one in the wound world knew the true meaning of the word Valhalla, but Brando's heart was clear. Legend said that Odin had his maid Valkyrie lead the heroic spirits to this great hall in the Glacier Forest, preparing for the dusk of the gods in the future. But just from the concept of raising soldiers, the Valhalla fortress in the wound world was indeed worthy of this name. But it was a pity, Veronica gasped at this time. It can control the central crystal of the entire city. Doesn't that mean that it can mobilize the magic power of the entire city? Is this a huge magic fortress? Brando of course knew what she was thinking. Such a fortress was almost equivalent to the floating city of the Bugis. That was the legacy of the Silver Folk. It was impossible that the people of Cruz would not be tempted. But he shook his head and replied, not the whole city, but the whole territory. What? This time, not only Veronica, but also Mephisto and Farina could not help but exclaim. What kind of concept was a magic territory? But Brando still shook his head. It's not that simple. What do you mean? Veronica was a little tempted. After all, she was a female general of the empire. If the loop of trade winds, which was originally just an enclave, was not enough to attract her, then a legendary magic territory was too tempting for her. You'll know when you come and see. Brando released the crystal in his hand and invited Veronica. His action stunned the lady slightly. She looked at him in surprise. You're asking me to come? Veronica looked at Brando curiously and confusedly. His action was equivalent to putting the entire defense system of the fortress under her control. Brando smiled and nodded. Veronica saw Brando's reaction and did not ask any more questions. She put her hand on the crystal ball, raised her eyebrows slightly, and then lowered them again. Then a look of realization appeared on her face. What's wrong, Army Commander? Farina asked curiously. I see. I was wondering why you trusted me so much. Even though Veronica did not understand the ancient language, she could tell that the underground city had been severely damaged. Perhaps it was because of the erosion of time that the entire city was almost completely paralyzed. How badly was the city damaged? Is it possible to repair it? She asked. Brando shook his head. He had no intention of hiding the truth. The entire city was almost completely destroyed. Apart from the core of the city, the rest of the city is just an empty shell. There's no way to repair it. What a pity, Mephisto and Veronica said at the same time. Sly. Farina glared at him. It was indeed a pity. This was a legend in a magic territory. But Brando nodded. He was not sad at all. Because he already knew from the final text that this fortress was not the historical Valhalla, and the real Valhalla was still sleeping in this underground fortress. Because from the very beginning, the Valhalla people had created 2 central crystals. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 473. After igniting the fire seed and confirming that the core crystal of the entire dungeon had completely lost its function, the group began to search the entire dungeon to see if there were any leftover benefits. The so-called adventure was to not return empty-handed. Moreover, ever since the fall of Erwin in the game, Brando had never been so comfortable going deep into the dungeon. In the past, when he teamed up with others, he would more or less be wary of his teammates behind his back. This was not something that had never happened before. The world of Woned was too big, and it was common for people to hide in any random country and disappear without a trace. Therefore, many people acted unscrupulously and made people fearful. However, exploring the dungeon with Veronica and Greysword Saint Mephistopheles made Brando feel much more relaxed. Veronica was a woman of her words and had extremely high standards. She might not be interested in things that Brando was interested in, and she might not be able to recognize the things that she was interested in. Therefore, Brando was certain that this cruise goddess of war would be his. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles was a guy who did not have any materialistic desires. Simply put, he was in fact a training maniac. If not for the burden of his country, he might have already reached Andesh's level. And now, he still needed Brando to help him restore his country, and it was even more impossible for him to do anything that was disadvantageous to Brando. In this way, Brando was equivalent to bringing 2 powerful bodyguards to explore. The underground ruins of the Silver Folk should have at least 1 or 2 silver legacies. Brando was full of confidence, but he did not expect that after wandering around the dungeon for a few hours, he did not find a single magical item. The mana in the entire Valhalla ruin seemed to have been decomposed, and even the magical items had lost their power at this moment. They had once passed through a corridor where a fierce battle had taken place. There were still a large number of ownerless and broken weapons and armors on the ground. At a glance, they could tell that these weapons and armors were once magical equipment. The mysterious runes and engravings on them were clearly visible, but they couldn't sense any trace of magic power. Almost the entire dungeon was like this. Brando even found some magical items that were used in daily life, such as illuminating crystals and magic-infused furnaces. Unfortunately, they had lost their magic and could not be used anymore. It was obvious that the city had been affected by some kind of powerful anti-magic spell. But what kind of magic could sweep through the entire city? It was as if there was a storm going on. Brando, Veronica, and Mephisto were a little surprised. In their knowledge, the largest war in prehistory took place at the end of the Dark Year thousands of years ago. It was the war between the 4 saints and the Darkness Dragon. However, the highest level of magic used in that war was only a 14th level forbidden spell. It was impossible for it to reach such a level. The war that had taken place in Valhalla should have at least surpassed the war before that era. In other words, these silver folk were most likely from the Age of Chaos. Their war was before ancient times, when the greatest enemy of civilization was the powerful monsters in the chaos. But although he could not get any magical items, Brando did not let go of the broken weapons and armors. He collected all of them with the dimensional hole. There was no iron or intonagel, so these armors and weapons could still be used after being reheated. Especially the silver folk, the base materials for these equipment were quite high-end. Some were even forged with star-shaped gold. Brando could not help but secretly exclaim at the extravagance. Star-shaped gold was one of the materials with the best anti-magic effect among metals, and because it was an associated ore with adamantine, its production was extremely low. Veronica was secretly amused when she saw him collecting all these junk. In her eyes, this young man always did things out of his own will. If it were any other nobles in front of her, they would not do such a thing so openly in front of her. Of course, the goddess of war of the empire did not think that Brando had nothing to do with nobles. Instead, it was Vahina who sneered at Brando for being a miser who had never seen money, but Brando accepted this evaluation. Tonajul and his new territory were just starting out, and everything was difficult at the beginning. When they needed money, he did not mind being stingy. Besides, even the whole of Erewhon was just a corner of the border compared to the Cruz Empire. It was almost the same as Tonajul compared to the whole of Erewhon, so his ABs could not be compared to the empire. Brando understood this very well. You're so stupid. Brando's shamelessness angered the young lady of the Flower Leaf territory. She did not understand how Brando could see such a shameful thing, especially when she kindly reminded him but was ignored. Of course, this noble lady would never admit that she did so because she did not want Brando to embarrass himself in front of Veronica. They found many such battlefields in the ruins of Valhalla. The Silver Ancestors' defenders seemed to be resisting in every street, but in the end, they were defeated and killed. Brando collected these weapons and armors every time he passed by, and in the end, there were at least tens of thousands of them piled up into a mountain in the dimensional cave. Fortunately, the size of the dimensional cave was only related to the strength of the creator. Amon's dimensional cave was almost as big as a cave. Brando estimated that the creator of this dimensional cave was at least a spellcaster above level 70. Not to mention the original items in the dimensional cave, just the dimensional cave itself was enough to make him rich. In that case, Amon, the captain of the transport company, could not rest in peace. Brando, Scarlet, Veronica, and Mephisto finally stopped after checking almost 2/3 of the underground city. They did not need to go any further. They were completely sure that Valhalla had been completely destroyed, and of course, there were no magical items left in it. After confirming this, Veronica and Mephisto lost interest in this place. This was especially true for the goddess of war herself. Not only did she fail to find any clues to the thing she wanted, she even lost a few outstanding young people. Although this blow was not enough to shake her prestige in the empire, it was more or less because of this reason that she had no intention of staying here any longer. She quickly expressed her intention to leave to Brando. The goddess of war did not even intend to return to the Green Tower. Apart from a few lucky ones who stayed in White Cliff, there were almost no survivors. Therefore, she planned to bring the remaining people back to the Empire through the Wolf's Pass. She did not want to deal with the Druids. Brando more or less understood Veronica's mentality. They had a conflict with the Druids in the Green Tower, and with Veronica's pride, she would not allow her potential enemies to see her in such a miserable state. However, Brando thought that the Druids might not be much better off now. Or rather, it should be said that none of the forces that stayed in this area were in a good state. The Cruz Empire was considered to be in a better state compared to the other forces. At the very least, they still had some of their followers. But then again, before the war, Brando's forces from Tonajul could be said to be the weakest force. However, after the war, they were the ones that suffered the least losses. Even the youths who went out to train themselves did not suffer any losses. Although this was all thanks to his foresight, Veronica felt that it was a little too ironic. However, Brando did not intend to stay any longer. Right now, Valhalla could be said to be a dead city. It was meaningless to him, not to mention that he had already found a second central crystal in his previous exploration. This crystal was completely different from the previous one. It was gray and looked like a walnut. If it wasn't for the information he received from the first crystal, he wouldn't have been able to recognize it. If Brando could not recognize it, Veronica and the Ash Sword Saint would definitely not be able to recognize it. Just like that, he managed to obtain it without anyone noticing. However, after obtaining it, he realized that rebuilding Valhalla was not a simple matter. This crystal was the highest level of the city's central core. The first level of the crystal extended to a radius of 3 kilometers, and it could transfer mana to 20 buildings at the same time. It did not seem like much, but there were only so many buildings that needed to be transferred. Mage towers, magic circles, forges, lairs, and so on. These buildings were not cheap to build. Even if it cost half of 20 buildings, Brando would not be able to build them in a short time. His current goal was to arrange for a hydro lair and a magic forge. At most, he would add Amandina's magic laboratory in the future so that this quiet girl could research her mana transmission device in peace. Other than sympathy, Brando's original purpose of letting Amandina join him was for this future treasure. Although Amandina volunteered to be his assistant, and she was indeed outstanding, she had not discovered her true value. Brando did not want to bury such a genius. However, these were all things that would happen in the future. After Brando obtained the central crystal, he found out that the core of Valhalla was a central hall called the World Tree Temple. First, he had to build this hall and activate the central crystal in his hand. Only then would the core of his territory be able to spread out in all directions. However, this so-called World Tree Temple was built by planting the central crystal, just like planting a tree. The entire process would take nearly 2 weeks. Although Brando did not understand why such a strange method was used to build the temple, he could not stay in this damned place for 2 weeks. Ever since he entered the central region of the Loop of Trade Winds, he had completely lost contact with the outside world. Although it had not even been a day, his territory was surrounded by powerful enemies and could be in danger at any time. He had to straighten out everything here as soon as possible, and then return with the benefits of this adventure to deal with any enemies that might come. As for the matter of rebuilding the World Tree Temple, he could leave it to Amandina after leaving this place, and then ask the druids for help. There should not be any problems. Because of this, when Veronica expressed her intention to leave, Brando simply expressed his willingness to leave with her. Veronica was a little surprised by this, but she was happy to see it. She admired Brando, and did not mind showing this admiration. After Brando chose to leave, Mephisto naturally had no reason to stay. He had originally come to find trouble with Veronica alone, but he did not expect to form a temporary alliance with Veronica and Brando. But now, this temporary alliance was about to take root and grow at the edge of Erewhon's wilderness. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheedian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 474. When he walked out of the Loop of Trade Winds, he paused for a moment. What's wrong? Veronica turned around and asked. It's nothing. Brando shook his head. The moment he walked out of the wind wall, he felt a connection with his summoned creature. Medisha and the Shire immediately reported to him what was happening in his territory. In less than a day, Count Randner had already made his move. The harsh winter in Erewhon was not yet over, and it was much earlier than Brando had expected. He asked Medisha to praise the little Roman in their telepathic communication, but he was not too surprised by the news. The entire ABs had been preparing for this war for months, and they were waiting for this day. Besides, it would be too fake if they could not survive the first few weeks of the war. He then gave a few more instructions to Seal and asked the young mage to continue supervising the druids in his territory to reinforce the defensive line along the river. He also asked Seal to keep him updated on the situation once the battle started. Brando suddenly realized that the Planeswalker's telepathic communication ability was really overpowered. It could even give him the ability to command the battlefield from afar. Although there were other magical items that could achieve the same effect, in a low-intensity war like the one in Erewhon, neither side could afford to pay such a price. But then he immediately sensed a weak telepathic call that should not exist. Mephistopheles. Brando stared in disbelief at the cute girl who appeared in front of him. She was covered in blood, and her black dress was torn to shreds. Even her shoulders were exposed. Mephistopheles was lying in a pile of rubble, seemingly unconscious. She seemed to have climbed up from the bottom of the canyon. Perhaps she thought that Brando was still at the top, but she lost consciousness due to exhaustion. Mephistopheles seemed to have sensed Brando's call. Perhaps it was because of the special connection between a planeswalker and a planeswalker, but in the next moment, she suddenly blinked and woke up. The young girl's gentle face revealed a dreamy expression. Although her fair face was covered in blood, she still glowed with radiance. "Master, you've finally found me. I've been looking for you for a long time." Brando finally understood that the Mephistopheles did not enter the graveyard after Andesha knocked them out of the canyon. They had lost contact with each other when they entered the fog below. It was not strange when he thought about it. Mephistopheles had been strengthened many times at that time, and their strength was close to Veronica's. How could they die so easily? Perhaps it was because the cards had been reset every day, and their strength had returned to normal. That was why they fainted halfway through the climb. Brando could not help but breathe a sigh of relief when he saw that the vampire was still around. Mephistopheles were gold-tier creatures, and they could reach elemental strength through sacrifice. With her around, it was equivalent to having a powerful ally. However, Brando still could not treat his summons as cards. He could not help but ask guiltily when he saw the girl in such a state. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Mephistopheles shook her head, but her face was a little red. "I'm just a little hungry, master." Under Scarlet's blushing face and behind his strange gaze, 2 sweet teeth marks appeared on Brando's neck. "Wait, didn't you say you can't bite my neck?" No matter how much Mephistopheles looked like a woman, Brando could not accept being bitten by a man on the neck. But he did not expect the Mephistopheles to be so fast. Even he could not react in time. Vampires were known for their speed. Back then, Andesha's strength was 2 ranks higher than Brendel's, and Brando's current strength was only at the upper middle of gold tier. Mephistopheles revealed 2 cute little fangs and answered shyly with a blushing face, "Because Mephistopheles is heavily injured, so I need Master's blood." And Master's blood is delicious. Brando could only look at the heavens speechlessly. Moreover, Mephistopheles was indeed injured because of him. Therefore, he could only strictly order this transvestite vampire not to approach his neck unless he had permission to do so. The small interlude soon calmed down. No matter what, Brando was willing to see his side become stronger in order to deal with the challenges from the north. A day later, the group finally left the canyon and returned to the Pass of Wolves. The terrifying scene from before was no longer visible in the Pass of Wolves. After the flame seed was ignited, order was slowly being restored outside the loop of trade winds. At this moment, the dark forest welcomed its first morning after many days. The forest was quiet, and there were still sparkling dewdrops hanging from the leaves. But everything seemed peaceful. Regardless of whether it was the crews, Erwin, or the remaining tree elves and centaurs, all of them came out from under the white stone. Brando, Veronica, and the others had not returned for a few days. Their return caused quite a commotion in the temporary camp. The first person Brando saw was Amandina running over in a hurry, followed by Falerne and her younger sister. Tia had been revived during the reset, but the others did not know about it. They only thought that she had lost her way and found her way back. "My lord." Amandina was wearing a leather robe. She stood in front of Brando and exhaled a white breath. No matter how calm she appeared on the surface, she could not hide the relief and joy in her eyes. "I'm back." Brando did not miss Amandina's tired expression, but to this girl he trusted the most, his answer was only a slight nod. That was enough. He and Amandina were actually very similar people. Their minds were clear, and they could understand each other's thoughts. As the best of partners, they did not need to speak much to understand each other's thoughts. This was the unreserved trust between them. Even if the emperor of the Cruz Empire valued her talent and personally came to hire her, she would not be willing to leave this place. She believed that other than Brando, no one else could give her this kind of trust and understanding. Amandina began to believe that this kind of trust was beyond the hazy love between a man and a woman. It was purely a kind of mutual need and dependence on each other. Brando did not ask any more questions. He raised his head and looked at the white stone. The arrogant second son of Lord Maxon, Carglass, smiled and bowed his head in greeting. It was almost like the etiquette of a retainer. This young man, who was supposed to stand on the side of the nobles, had chosen to fight for another cause. In the past few months of battles, including the performance during the Wolf Tide, he had won the basic trust of Brando. With this foundation of trust, he had everything. Behind Carglass were the youths from Erewhon. They were still immature, and there were even some nobles among them. After the calamity of wolves, these youths seemed to have found their own direction in the turbulence of history. They were reborn, and their expressions showed maturity and determination. "My lord." When the youths saw Brando and the others walking out of the forest, they quieted down. The story of the past few days was like a legend that they had personally experienced. Brando alone entered the loop of trade winds and ignited the flame's seed at the most critical moment. They saw with their own eyes the moment the calamity of wolves was completely eliminated. Such a magnificent scene made everyone feel as if they could hear the loud bang of history and the future. Just a day ago, the Druids of the Green Tower had also sent people to express their gratitude. After the Druids, the mercenaries and the survivors of other forces, apart from the envoys of other countries, more or less came to express their gratitude. Not to the Kurlutz people, but to the Green Tower. This confirmed the guesses of the youths. On that night, when the pillars of light that represented order disappeared in the violent storm, only one person lit up the lighthouse of this world. This time, Erewhon was the main character. Even the Cruz Empire had to step aside. Of course, Brando didn't know that his actions had won him many potential friends. The survivors of the calamity of wolves were more or less indebted to him. One couldn't imagine the gratitude one would feel when a stranger saved one's life in a desperate situation. When the calamity of wolves was at its most violent, everyone thought that the darkness had completely suppressed the light. Even the last trace of order had disappeared. The Green Tower's light was about to be extinguished. But when a ray of light flashed from the bottom of their eyes and completely dispelled the darkness, everyone had the same question in their hearts. What was that? But when they learned of Brendel's plan from the Druids, the shock in their hearts was indescribable. Of course, this sudden shock and gratitude might only be temporary. But in any case, when Brando interacted with these people in the future, this moment of gratitude would earn him a lot of points. This was a huge gain for him. But Brando didn't know this at the moment. He only felt that these youths were unbelievably quiet when they saw him. He had a high prestige among these youths before, but that was the prestige of a lord. But at this moment, they looked at him as if he was their king. If one day they became knights, they would answer to Brando's call and fight for a heroic king. This was the dream of countless young knights. After the four sages, there was only one such king in the past, and that was Erewhon's predecessor, King Eric. But he had passed away, and Wond had been calling for heroes for 100 years. Looking at these youths, Brando was satisfied. The embryonic form of the White Lion Legion had appeared. He took a step forward and placed his right hand on the hilt of Halran Gaia. The calamity of wolves is over, but your true enemy is right before your eyes. Now, follow me and prepare to return to the Green Tower. Long live Erewhon! Long live Erewhon! Everyone was in an uproar. P.S. I'm sorry, but I forgot to delete the draft when I was writing. I only discovered it after a book friend reminded me. But there are still more than 3,200 words left. But Chi-Dian can only edit more, not less. Damn it, it's really troublesome. Let's take up more words at the end. I'll post the attributes of Heaven's Chosen here. The readers in the group have been asking about it. Heaven's Chosen is a Halo-type talent. The first attribute is to increase the morale and defense of the troops under your command. You must be a direct subordinate. There is no limit to the number of races under your command, and your territory's honor will increase faster. Territory's honor is a special resource of the Lord system. It can be used to increase the power of items like the core crystal. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it on Chidien. Calm. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 475. The situation of the Druid surprised Brendel quite a bit. There were more than 1,000 survivors in the Green Tower, and the number of Druid apprentices and tree elves that came to the Loop of Trade Winds was more than a quarter of the total population of the Loop of Trade Winds. This was a lot better than the calamity of wolves that happened in history, where most of the Druids were killed. Brando had thought that the Druids would have to pay a heavy price for rewinding history by himself, but it seemed that he had done a better job than expected. The thousands of players in history might not have been of much use, but the two great adepts of the Silver Alliance, William and Tolman, had been the stabilizing force of the situation. The Druids welcomed them back from the Loop of Trade Winds with the highest ceremony. Even though there were many things that needed to be done in the city, hundreds of high-grade Druids still drew out their precious mana from the pool of nature to lay down a path of flowers for Brando from the Wall of Roses. The day they arrived at the Green Tower, the entire city had turned out in full force. The young nobles were excited because Brando had joked that there might be elven beauties who would give them a kiss. Of course, the scene they had imagined did not happen. The elven girls were still reserved and cautious. They hid in the forest and looked at the heroes of other races with curiosity. There were no kisses, but at least everyone received a wreath from the elven girls. Brando even received two, but he did not have time to see the faces of the two elven girls who gave him the wreaths. The one who led the Druid elders to welcome them was Quinn. The leader of the tree elves walked up to Brendel and opened his arms to hug the youth. He gently patted the youth's shoulders. This was the highest form of respect a hunter could give to a comrade. It was obvious that the leader of the tree elves had acknowledged the honor of fighting alongside Brendel. To the elves, this was a friendship of life and death. Quinn took a step back and spoke in the language of the tree elves, Aten Mistaler. The forest is evergreen with you, my friend. Aterosdar, ex Dorman. The forest is evergreen, and the bowstring is humming. Brendel replied calmly in the tree elven language. A trace of surprise flashed across Quinn's face. The tree elves' language, which was developed from the wood tribe's language, was completely different from the wind elves' language. He didn't expect Brando to understand the meaning of his words, but he didn't expect that not only did he understand, but his reply was also completely in line with the tree elves' etiquette. The Druid elders behind Quinn were also surprised. It was unthinkable for a human to know so much about their habits and habits. Of course, they didn't know that Brando was different from ordinary people. He had lived in many places and understood many cultures and customs that ordinary people didn't know. At this moment, Quinn revealed a kind smile and said, "You didn't disappoint us and we won't go against our oath. You are now the lord of this land." He raised both his hands and revealed a white acorn in his palms. Brando was shocked when he saw the white acorn. "This is the fruit of the white sacred oak. You're giving this to me." In the tree elves' traditions, they worshipped the white sacred oak, which was the guardian of all souls in the forest. There was a white sacred oak in the Green Tower where the fire seed was stored. It was the spiritual home of all elves and druids. Quinn gave him the fruit of the white sacred oak, which meant that he regarded him as his lord. Generally speaking, only the Grand Druid Elder had the right to hold the fruit of the white sacred oak. "You should be familiar with our traditions, right, Brando?" Quinn held the fruit with both hands and said to Brando. Brando nodded and looked at the smiling Quinn and the druids behind him in surprise. Could it be that they were bowing down to him because he had saved this place? That was a little too ridiculous. Quinn seemed to have seen through Brando's doubts and explained, according to tradition, we and the druids would follow our traditions and gradually move out of the civilized areas to guard the new Black Forest. However, my lord, we've carefully considered your proposal. If you're willing to open up the wilderness and follow the path of the ancient sages, we're willing to submit to you. You're also thinking of recuperating, right? Brando asked. Quinn had a look of appreciation on his face. As tree elves, they rarely beat around the bush during negotiations. Brendel was clearly aware of their habits and was willing to do as the Romans did. Quinn nodded. Yes, we and the druids will need a few years to recuperate. During this time, we'll be able to witness you fulfill your promise. I'm afraid a few years won't be enough. But if you just want to see if I'm a man of my word, I don't mind. Brando nodded and secretly rejoiced. Things had gone much smoother than he had expected. He had told the druids about his long-term plans so that he could keep the tree elves, druids, and centaurs. Of course, the Green Tower had suffered heavy losses. Although their population was better than before, most of them were elderly, children, and women. The warriors had suffered heavy losses during the calamity of wolves. Even if they joined him, they wouldn't be able to provide much help in the upcoming war. At most, they would be a long-term investment. However, Brando didn't make a decision immediately after receiving the oak fruit. He pondered for a moment before saying, "But I think it's best if we remain allies. This is my territory, but it's also your home. We have a common goal, so there's no need for formalities." Why? Quinn didn't expect Brando to decline. He could see that this young man's goal was this land. I need a wholehearted ally, not a subordinate who feels restrained. Brando replied. He knew that the tree elves and druids wouldn't be used to living like humans. Since that was the case, he might as well be generous. After all, the druids and tree elves would definitely join his army to protect their homeland. Quinn gave him a serious look and turned to look at the other druid elders. Everyone had a satisfied look on their faces. You're the most unique human I've ever met. Brando, can we be friends? Quinn asked. Brendel nodded. Friends needed time to grow, and he understood what the tree elf meant. Then, my friend, may I invite you to our celebration? Quinn asked with a smile. However, Brando shook his head and said, I'm afraid not. Quinn, I need your help. Help? Yes. I'm going to leave this place and return to my territory. However, I need a batch of supplies, armor, and weapons. Also, I need a group of Pegasi that can quickly send us out of the dark forest. Brando replied. As soon as he said this, the surroundings immediately quieted down. Carglass and Coden finally understood why Brando was in such a hurry to bring everyone back to the Green Tower. It seemed like something had happened in the territory. Quinn pondered for a moment. Are you in trouble, human friend? Yes. My territory is under threat. I need to solve this problem before I can return to fulfill my promise with you. Is it a war? Brando nodded. The tall tree elf leader had a look of understanding in his eyes. He straightened his body and turned around to face his people in the forest. Did you hear that? Our human ally needs an army that can fight. He once went into a dangerous place alone and saved everyone here from the darkest of situations. Now, my fellow tree elves, are you the kind of people who cherish your own lives? Quinn's voice reverberated throughout the forest. Brando was stunned. He knew the current situation of the druids and knew that it was impossible for them to continue participating in the war. However, what the tree elf leader was doing now was to gather an army. Quinn, I want to fight by your side, human friend. Quinn smiled at him. You're right. This is your territory and our home. Without bloodshed and battle, how can we protect this precious treasure? There was no passionate reply. Instead, the elves with longbows walked out of the forest one after another. Most of them were women because most of the adult males had perished in the calamity of wolves. Then came the centaurs. Of course, the centaurs would not back down in the pursuit of glory. The druids also responded to the call. They were a group of people who did not care about the outside world, but that did not mean that they were indifferent to the outside world. Just like what they had promised, the war to protect was meaningful to them. Even so, the army that had gathered outside the forest only had a few hundred people. The druids had suffered heavy losses in the calamity of wolves, and this was something that could not be helped. However, to everyone's surprise, before the elves could stand still, another group of elves walked out of the forest. They were mercenaries and adventurers. These humans were wearing a variety of armor and looked like an army of beggars, but they all stood out. After these people walked out, the forest became silent again. Soon, a man was elected from the group. "My lord, thanks to your grace, we were able to survive this calamity. Now, I heard that you need an army." The bearded, sloppy man blinked his eyes, spread his hands, and asked lazily, "Then, if I may be so bold as to ask, do you need an army that is born for war and is willing to accept your employment?" Brando suddenly felt a little speechless. "What price can you offer?" he asked in a deep voice as if he was really negotiating a price. "How about a gold coin?" the man asked. Brando looked at him. "Good, now you are my knight. 1 gold coin, and I promise to bring you to witness my victory," he replied. Without any unnecessary words, the mercenaries pulled out their swords and raised them high. A forest of swords. Then, the elves knocked their longbows. Brando suddenly felt a strange feeling in his heart. Humans and elves stood together again after thousands of years. The sacred oath of the past seemed to be replayed at this moment. No one would forget today's oath of alliance. Everyone who witnessed this moment would remember it for the rest of their lives. The young people behind him also pulled out their swords. This scene was too shocking. Even Coden and Mephisto, who did not have a clear sense of belonging, could not help but lose their ability to speak. This alliance did not seem strong, but in the end, it seemed to have a magical power that could change everything. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 476. The combined forces of the humans and elves numbered close to 1,000. However, the adventurers and mercenaries who dared to venture into the dark forest were all elites. Most of them were at the pinnacle of the iron rank, and some were even at the silver rank. The tree elves were about the same. Those who were able to survive the calamity of wolves were at least at the silver rank. An army of nearly 1,000 silver-ranked and iron-ranked soldiers that were equivalent to Aween's knights and sergeants. Even the best army in Aween did not have such a luxurious lineup. Imagine the expression on Count Randner's face if such an army suddenly appeared on the battlefield that he did not expect. The druids were working day and night to prepare the equipment for the army. There were great druids guarding the nature's pool and the green tower at all times. They used magic to create ironwood armor. Even though it was not as hard as real steel, it was much lighter and lighter. The centaur's smithy was lit up throughout the night, and the clanking of metal could be heard from miles away. Swords, spears, and halberds were constantly being produced and delivered to the hands of the centaur's smiths. The other factions that were still in the Green Tower also sent their own smiths over. The mountain dwarves even volunteered to join the centaur's smiths in the smithy to guide them in their work. Therefore, you could often see such a spectacle. A few dwarves, centaurs, and elves would stand together and argue with each other. Such a scene could only be seen in the era of the War of the Holy Saints. However, Brando knew that these factions either did not have any conflict of interest with Erwin, or did not even have any border with Erwin. This was why their envoys could express their gratitude to him. Even the coldest faction supported Brando verbally. If Brando were to return to the Empire, they would support him in the Holy Cathedral. This was a colleague from the Holy Cathedral of Fire. On the other hand, the Wind Elves claimed that they did not need to send reinforcements directly. The elegant elven envoy even joked that the Wind Elves had a precious friendship with their late king, Eric. But this was not a joke. Saint Tassol and Cruz had clashed with each other every year. The Saint Tassol people were only worried that they would not be able to seize the opportunity to send reinforcements. They were not worried that their neighbors would fly into a rage. These evil elves could not wait for His Majesty to die from anger. Even so, Brando still declined the other party's good intentions. After all, if the Saint Tassol were to intervene, it would become a war between the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Holy Cathedral of Wind. Brando didn't want to start a holy war, and he didn't want to stand against the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this regard, Orthlis had the same opinion. Although Orthlis was a wind elf, at this moment, she was on Brando's side. Naturally, she had to consider the issue from the standpoint of Erwin's people. Her foresight had been experienced for thousands of years, and her wisdom in politics could only be better than Brando's. In the next few days, Brando met with an unexpected guest, Count Audine. It turned out that Erwin's envoy was not completely wiped out that day. Count Audine, Dolent, and a few other small nobles were saved by Anderson, who was passing by. At this moment, Brando's prejudice against Erwin's envoy was completely gone. From the moment Audine led the others to return and fight side by side with the centaur elder Widd, he thought that at least the descendants of the late king could pick up the long-lost flag from the battlefield. Then, the will of the Lionheart sword could also be inherited. Even so, the purpose of Audine's visit still surprised Brando. The Count looked at him deeply before telling him that they would consider persuading Her Highness to stand on his side. This was the first time Brando received kindness from a high-ranking noble in the kingdom. This was extremely important to him because his ultimate wish was not to stand against Her Highness. However, the change in Audine's attitude still surprised him. He knew that the internal strife of the nobles in the Erwin kingdom would definitely not change just because he saved their lives. Odin was a soldier before he was a noble, and Brendel trusted his character. Brendel knew that Odin was a soldier first, and he was a nobleman after that. But Audine's answer was simple. After that day's charge, everyone who went through life and death with him had the same realization. It was as if the flag of the late king was once again flying on the battlefield, but the flag of Erwin had not shone for too long. After that day's battle, almost all of the people of Erwin who went along with him cried. It was not because of the fear of surviving, but because of regret. They were ashamed of their ancestors, and they were regretful of the lost glory. It had been many years since Audine had such a hot-blooded pursuit. He did not know who would be able to pick up King Eric's white flag. He used to place his hopes on the royal family of Corvado, but that day, he saw something different in Brando and the people who fought side by side with him. It was the kind of temperament that Bugge and the cunning fox had seen once in the south. It was the kind of oath that seemed to be engraved on the Lionheart sword. It was the belief that belonged to Erwin. I only ask that you promise to always stand on the side of Erwin, on the side of King Eric and his descendants. After saying this, Audine and Count Dolent left. Brando nodded. He had won the first promise from a noble in Erwin. This promise tied him to the same war chariot in history. Now, everything was back to square one. The preparations for the war between the humans and the elves continued day after day. Brando originally planned to finish all the work in half a month, but the news from his territory had confirmed that Madara was involved. There were also many pieces of evidence that pointed to the commander of the skeletons being Incersta's right-hand man, Tarkus the One-Eyed Dragon. This was definitely bad news. Madara was like a sharp sword hanging over Brando's head. He had no choice but to bring forward the date by a week. After a week, the army had to move out. Of course, Brando did not slack off during this week. His priority was to increase his strength, and the best way to do so was to extract the EXP from the Book of Mavacart. That thing was like a treasure trove to him. When he was in the center of the loop of trade winds, he had only extracted a small amount of EXP, and he had already received around 30,000 EXP, leveling up from a level 27 mercenary to a level 28 one only required around 130,000 EXP. Of course, Brando did not dare to show this ability to Veronica when she was around. Even though the Cruz Empire's goddess of war was very fond of him, the Cruz Empire was still a potential enemy. Moreover, it was easy to be suspicious of someone who was growing stronger with every passing second. After Veronica left, Brando was in a hurry to return to the Green Tower. He did not have time to deal with the Amon's Book of Inheritance. It wasn't until the Elven and human allied armies were formed, and the Druid cities began to operate at full capacity that he finally had the time to spare. Brando asked Quinn to prepare a quiet room for him. He then took out the Book of Mavacart and began to touch it. Even though he was mentally prepared, the 130,000 EXP required for leveling up from level 27 to level 28 came to an end in just 2 minutes. When the system notification sounded, Brando was shocked by the speed of leveling up. It was faster than sitting on a rocket. It was so strange that it felt unreal. Brando suppressed the excitement and shock in his heart. The feeling of seeing his EXP bar skyrocket was too good. He almost wanted to stand up and dance for joy. After going through so much, he still had a basic level of calmness. He took a deep breath and continued to guide the energy into his own laws. 5 minutes later, 170,000 EXP was obtained. His mercenary level was now level 29. 10 minutes later, 220,000 EXP was obtained. His mercenary level was now level 30. Leveling up 3 times in half an hour was unrealistic. Brando looked at the ball of black light in his hand. Even after losing 500,000 EXP, it did not seem to have decreased. This meant that the power of the Book of Mavacart was greater than he had imagined. Brando couldn't help but tremble a little. After reaching level 30, he was not in a hurry to continue leveling up. Instead, he went to the Centaur's settlement and looked for a warrior grandmaster to discuss some problems regarding combat skills. Of course, he was not there to chat. Instead, he was there because once a class reached level 30, it would be able to learn a core skill related to that class. Skills exclusive to a class could be trained to master rank, but core skills required a certain level of attainment in that class. This level of attainment was usually at level 30, 40, and 60. After level 60, it was a completely different concept. Brando did not want to think about the chain quests related to Element Quest and Perfect Body for the time being. Brando had been to the Green Tower before, so he was quite familiar with the place after the Calamity of Wolves. Sure enough, he found the master warrior called Mainhoof in the Centaur district. Mainhoof looked no different from an ordinary centaur, but in reality, half of his blood flowed from the scorching river. He wasn't particularly outstanding among the master warrior NPCs in Woned, but Brando knew that there were 2 very powerful battle techniques taught by him. The first was called Piercing Strike. It was one of the most powerful low-level warrior skills, even surpassing some of the mid-level skills. It also had a chance to deal double critical damage. It was one of the early core skills of a warrior. The second skill was even stranger. It could only be used once and would not be added to the list of skills. This skill was called Bloodline Awakening. It was one of the innate abilities of a demon. Simply put, this ability reset the experience points of a player's skills. In fact, this was the only chance for players to reset their experience points before they could obtain the meditation incense. P.S. Someone asked about the alpha wolf Akis. Of course, Akis is still alive. It's not that easy to wake up from the demigod slumber. Alpha Wolf Akis is the final boss of the Calamity of Wolves, worldwide, quest in the past. It will be mentioned later. Someone also asked about the issue of re-updating. Actually, re-updating is inevitable. It's just a bottleneck for me. I'll talk to you about the specifics when I have time. Anyway, I think I've figured it out. You can call it a breakthrough. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 477. Regardless of whether it was Bloodline Awakening or Piercing, there was a long chain of quests, but Brendel had an advantage. His reputation in the Green Tower was almost full, and Maine did not dare to refuse his request. He was even honored to teach him the skills. After obtaining Bloodline Resurgence, Brando removed all the skills from the Militia class and placed the Silver Elf skill, In-Depth Analysis, under the Mercenary class. The special riding skill, Dragon Hunt, was only a temporary skill, so it was only natural for him to remove it. Power Burst and Piercing Strike could not be used at the same time, and Frontal Assault was also eliminated for the same reason. The White Raven sword art was a bit of a pity, but this skill had already reached a bottleneck. It would be very difficult for him to progress further without the inheritance. Moreover, he was about to learn the 9 Luminary sword art, so after some hesitation, Brando removed the skill that had been with him since the beginning. The White Raven sword art was originally a modified version of the Wind Elves' Inheritance of the Stars. Even though Orthless herself was a moon inheritor, the legendary sword art would only be stronger, not weaker. After removing the main skills from the mercenary class, Brando received nearly 6,000 EXP. He spent half of it to upgrade Piercing Strike to Master, level 10. Now, Piercing Strike dealt 425% damage in a 30-meter cone with a 12.7% chance to deal a critical hit. Master Attribute, double the damage dealt during charge. Even though the attack range was much worse than the White Raven sword art, it was nothing compared to the damage dealt. With the Master Attribute, if he was lucky, he could deal 15 times the damage. Even though the chance was not much higher than winning the lottery, it was still much rarer than winning the lottery. The reason why he chose to reset his stats now was because he had his own considerations. Before entering the loop of trade winds, his first consideration was how to solve his current predicament. However, after gaining the trust of the Druids of Valhalla and the Green Tower, he believed that he had the ability to control his own destiny. To the players, they were originally bystanders. It could be said that they were born with this ability. But for the natives of this world, they had to put in a lot of effort to get to this point. And once he had this ability, it meant that he could design his own learning and growth path in the long run, just like the players. The goal of a player was to become the strongest. His goal was to shake an era with his own strength. In gaming terms, this meant that he had to play the role of carry. In the later stages of the game, he had to be a godly existence that could save the world. Of course, it was not that extreme, but it meant that he had to spend a lot of resources and carefully plan growth. Asterisk carry refers to the hero that is the core of the strategy in Dota games. This type of hero can even change the entire situation of the game in the later stages of the game, turning the tables and leading the entire team to victory. Brendel used it to refer to the fact that he needed this ability. The reason why Brando stopped the mercenaries at level 30 and the elementalists at level 25 was because these two levels represented an advancement. Frostblade, Frigid Knight, was a class that could control both the ice element and the warrior battle skills. He happened to know a fantasy weapon that was suitable for this class, Avelio's Golden Flame Ice. This sword belonged to the daughter of the future Yura, Erwin's last legitimate bloodline, Princess Alala Ophelia. However, for the sake of the current Erwin, Brando felt that he could only let this unborn girl suffer a little. With his understanding of the Amber Sword, he had already planned this path during the battle that night. At that time, he had not obtained Halran Gaia yet. The Frigid Knight was a dual-wielding warrior. The main weapon was Halran Gaia, and the secondary weapon was Golden Flame Ice. In the future, he could also advance into the Frost-Earth Guard, which was related to the ice and earth elements. It was the best combination. To advance into a Frigid Knight, he needed to go to the Ice Elemental Plane's Eternal Frozen Glacier. Interplanar travel required a total character level of at least 80. In this regard, Brando planned to be a level 10 Temple Knight. After obtaining Conflict Aura, the Temple Knight could advance into a temple in Ampere Seal, which was only a month or two away. As for before that, although he could not level up, Brando had things to do. From reaching level 30 to learning Piercing Strike, Brando only took half a day. After that, he went back to the quiet room to wake up Orthless and prepare to learn 9 Luminaries sword art. This was his first trump card in this world. It could be regarded as a core ability in his character growth plan. Of course, he had to master it first. However, as soon as the Elven Knight taught him the skill, Brando was dumbfounded. The 9 Luminary sword art's properties were as follows. When attacking, an illusion would be created at the position before the user moved to attack the enemy. At most, the illusion would have 5% of the user's attack power. The illusion could use skills, but it would need to draw mana from the user. Wind Empress's Inheritance of the Moon wasn't like Gretel's Flash Strike sword art, which relied on speed to achieve multiple attacks. This was a magic sword art. Thinking about it, the so-called Inheritance of the Moon was naturally most closely related to the moon's magic power. However, this was not the reason why he was dumbfounded. It was the cost of learning this sword art, 3550 EXP, and that was only the EXP required to learn this sword art. Brando immediately wanted to kneel down. Military sword art only required a few EXP to level up from level 1 to level 2, but after reaching level 13, it would still require tens of thousands of EXP to level up. According to this ratio, wouldn't the 9 Luminary sword art's EXP after level 10 be like a bottomless pit? Seeing Brando's slightly darkened face, Orthless thought that there was a problem and could not help but ask, "What's wrong?" Brando shook his head. "It's too difficult." The Elven Knight was stunned for a moment, then she couldn't help but chuckle in his mind. Orthless had a smug look on her face. "So there are times when you find things difficult, little brother. I thought you knew how to do everything." She glanced at Brando and teased, "Ha ha ha, did you know that when I learned this sword art, I reached the beginner level before the age of 35. I was called one of the most talented inheritors of this sword art. How about it, don't let me down." Elves matured much slower than humans. A 35-year-old was equivalent to a 5 or 6-year-old human. Looking at the amount of EXP required, Brando knew how difficult this sword art was. To reach the beginner level at the age of 5 or 6, one could indeed be considered a genius. The so-called beginner level meant that one had to master the first 3 levels. This was not a problem for Brando. He glanced at Orthless. How could he let this big sister look down on him? After thinking for a while, he decided to put the rest of his EXP into this skill. Then, he took a step forward, leaving behind an afterimage that looked exactly like him. "This. You. Brando, how is this possible?" Orthless held her breath, her green eyes widening in disbelief. Even her mature and calm appearance looked a little cute. This was simply too inconceivable. Even with her nearly 1,000 years of experience, she couldn't help but be shocked to the extreme. If she could, Orthless would definitely shout, "Cheat," in her heart. This guy is cheating. However, Orthless did not know about the existence of this so-called cheat. In just a moment, Brando had grasped the essence and usage of the strongest and most core sword art in the Moon Inheritance. It was an ancient sword art that was even more powerful than a series of high-level sword arts. It was known as a cheat skill. Even in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, no one dared to say that they could create such a sword art. Flash Strike sword art, Nine Luminary sword art, and Cry of the Earth and Mountains were all such inheritances. Could it be that there really is such a genius in this world? Could it be that the legends of the divine people in history are true? Orthlis looked at Brando, her heart shaking like thunder. Who is this little guy? How could such an existence be born in this era? However, Brando did not notice Orthlis's shock, because he was also shocked by the power of the Nine Luminary sword art. Brando took a step forward, and the afterimage behind him seemed to have inherited all of his knowledge and sword art inheritance. It immediately took a step forward and corresponded with his position. If there were enemies around him at this time, the afterimage would be in a position to attack. Even if it was Brando himself, it would not be so. The afterimage only existed for a few tenths of a second before it disappeared. Since there were no enemies, it did not draw its sword. Although it was only a short time, it was more than enough for a battle where victory and defeat were often decided by a single line. Godly skill. What kind of skill could increase a person's combat strength by several times, and even give a person the ability to deal with multiple enemies at once? Even a high-level sword art would not be able to do such a thing. Brando looked at the Nine Luminary sword art's label, Extraordinary Ancient, shining like gold. In the next few days, Brando was completely immersed in the world of sword art. If he was as addicted to the game as he was back then, he had never even heard of such a powerful skill, let alone seen it in the game. After obtaining such a sword art, the first thing he needed to do was to raise it to the highest level possible. Although he did not have enough sword art EXP, it was not a problem. After all, he still had the remains of the Book of Mavacart. Without sword art EXP, he would convert it to normal EXP. He could still accept a 10:1 ratio, and so he spent the next week absorbing the power of the Book of Mavacart, hammering the sword art, absorbing it, and hammering it again. Other than daily activities, no one saw Brando come out of the silent room. Of course, his sword art had also improved by leaps and bounds. Brando tested his maximum absorption speed, and found that it was about 700,000 EXP per hour. However, the Book of Mavacart was a self-contained system, and even after it was broken, the natural law would still resist Brando's absorption. Due to the lack of consciousness, the resistance would gradually increase. Brando found that he could only absorb 2 to 3 million express per day, and then it would be difficult to continue. Since he did not need to level up, all of the EXP was converted into skill EXP. At first, his 9 Luminary sword art was leveling up at a rate of 2 levels per day, to the point that Orthlis was a little numb to it. This elven knight who had been through countless battles wondered if she was still in a dream. But on the third day, when the 9 Luminary sword art reached level 5, Brando found that the situation had changed. 9 Luminary sword art, expert, extraordinary/ancient when attacking, create an illusion at the position before moving to attack the enemy. A maximum of 5 illusion clones can be created. The illusion clones have 35% of the original user's attack power. The clones can use skills, but they need to draw mana from the original user. Expert effect. When the illusion clones are created, the original user can choose to swap positions with the illusion clones once. There's a special effect at the expert level. Brando was dumbfounded, but what made him even more dumbfounded was the amount of EXP required to learn the swordsmanship after it reached level 5. The number was clearly written on the back, 100321. 100,000. Brando could not help but want to scratch his head. Was this F***Kerr playing with him? 100,000 EXP at level 5. Then after level 10, wouldn't the EXP increase by tens of millions? That's hundreds of millions of EXP. Lady Martha. P.S. There was a problem with the network in the afternoon, and it's only been fixed now. But it's good that it's fixed, or else I would have been scolded. F***CK, this guy just said yesterday that he would definitely release more chapters, and today he stopped. Isn't this F***King cheating me? Isn't this F***King cheating me? Of course, I can't be so stupid, so I decided to climb back up. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheatyen.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 478. After the 9 Luminaries sword art had reached level 7, Brando gave up on the idea of improving it in the short term. Level 7 9 Luminaries sword art required more than 250,000 experience points. Even with Brando's speed of extracting experience points from Mavikart's tome, he could not keep up. At level 7, the 9 Luminaries sword art could already produce 8 illusions. The illusion's attack power had also reached 50%. He was only one step away from the highest level, which was 9 illusions. Brando also discovered that the duration of the illusions was related to the level of the swordsmanship. When he first learned the 9 Luminaries sword art, the duration of the illusion's duration was about 0.2 seconds. But at level 7, the duration of the illusion's duration was almost 1 second. It was an increase of 0.1 seconds for every level. When the illusions of the 9 Luminaries sword art used skills, they would drain his mana. The method of extraction seemed to be converting the required stamina into mana. Charge required 6 points and Pierce required 20 points. Mana was much less than stamina, not to mention that 9 illusions were draining him at the same time. Brando had 250 points of mana, but the 9 illusions charge could drain half of his mana. Pierce could drain almost all the mana in his mana pool. If the illusions were to use magic, although the duration of the illusion's duration was not enough for them to use most of their spells, Brando just so happened to have the spell-like skill, Tough Bark. He had tested it with Tough Bark before. When the illusions used magic, the consumption of mana seemed to be double. Brando used Tough Bark to exchange 50 points of mana for 1 point of armor, but the illusions used 100 points. Brando had also tested it. The illusions themselves could not use the 9 Luminaries sword art to create more illusions, and they could not take the initiative to exchange positions with him. After thoroughly understanding the 9 Luminaries sword technique's operating method and usage restrictions, Brando began to look for people to practice this sword technique. The person he was most familiar with was the old swordsman, Coden. However, after 2 days of sparring with Brando, the old swordsman had complained that he wanted to quit. After returning from the loop of trade winds, Brando's strength had reached the level of a gold-ranked swordsman. Furthermore, the 9 Luminaries sword art was just too strange. Even with Coden's strength, he was still easily defeated. No normal person would be willing to do such a thing, let alone Coden's dignity as a gold-ranked swordsman. So the next day, the old man decided not to come. Coden was gone, but Greysword Saint Mephistopheles somehow heard that Brando was practicing swordsmanship and came looking for him. The Ash Sword Saint was never one to beat around the bush, and as soon as he found Brando, he wanted to spar with him. Brando was a little puzzled. With the Ash Sword Saint's level of swordsmanship, there was no reason for him to spar with him. The difference in strength between the two of them was too great. But this was in the category of someone giving him a pillow when he wanted to sleep, so he naturally could not refuse. What he did not expect was that Mephistopheles actually suppressed his strength and patiently sparred with him. As a sword saint, Mephistopheles was naturally more knowledgeable than Coden. When Brando used the 9 Luminaries sword art, Mephistopheles' expression changed. It was an ancient inheritance. Mephistopheles patiently countered Brando's moves and pointed out the flaws in Brando's swordsmanship one by one. Mephistopheles did not have much to say about the 9 Luminaries sword art. It was an ancient skill that was beyond his level. However, he was a master of military swordsmanship. In fact, the military swordsmanship of each country was similar in this era. After all, it was a basic skill. The only difference was that the swordsmanship of each country differed greatly. Mephistopheles had been practicing Cruz's military swordsmanship since he was a child. The Cruz's swordsmanship and Erewhon's swordsmanship were closely related. After Mephistopheles' advice, Brando felt that his military swordsmanship, which had been stagnant for a long time, showed signs of loosening up. This made Brando both excited and curious. He was excited because if he could improve his military swordsmanship to LV-16, the benefits would be earth-shattering. However, he was curious because every sword saint seemed to have their own unique understanding of swordsmanship. Orthless was like this, and the Ash Sword Saint was like this. Their insights seemed to be very beneficial for him to improve his swordsmanship after LV-15. Brando could not help but think that if he visited all the sword saints of Wonde and obtained their insights, would his swordsmanship directly enter the Holy Realm? Of course, this was just a thought at most. Although there weren't many people in Wonde who could be crowned with the title of Sword Saint, there were still dozens of them. Among them, there was no lack of eccentric people, and there were even some who were evil. Compared to them, the Ash Sword Saint, Mephisto, was simply a normal person among normal people. To get the recognition of all these people, to be honest, this was an impossible task. Veronica was one of the extreme sword saints that Brendel knew, but he did not know if the Kurlutz goddess of war would be impressed enough to teach him her swordsmanship. Veronica had joked that she wanted to teach him swordsmanship, but the prerequisite was that he had to become a citizen of the Kurlutz Empire, which was impossible. Clang! Brando, who was still thinking, heard a crisp sound. Halran Gaia clashed with Mephisto's grey sword, and a huge force almost made him lose his grip on the sword. He hurriedly retreated, and the three illusions behind him immediately blocked Mephisto's path of attack. Only then did Brando manage to escape. Mephisto watched the three illusions disappear in front of him. He did not intend to take another step forward. He sheathed his sword and looked at Brando, who was panting, and asked, "Were you distracted just now?" Brando nodded and panted, "Yes." "Then let's call it a day," the Ash Sword Saint answered curtly. Brando nodded again. However, he stood up and could not help but ask, "Count Mephisto, we haven't known each other for long, but it has been almost half a month since the loop of trade winds. I know your character very well. With your character, you would never lower your head or express goodwill to anyone, right?" The Ash Sword Saint did not say a word, which meant that he agreed with Brando's words. "Then you should also know my character. I don't mind joking about small things, but since I promised Lady Veronica to help you restore your kingdom, I will not go back on my word or delay the time." Brando paused for a moment. "I think you came here today to teach me swordsmanship. When do you plan to leave the forest?" Mephisto asked. "The Druids have already prepared their weapons, and the elves and human mercenaries are ready to go. However, transportation for so many people is a problem. Even with the Druids and Tree Elves' abilities, they can't find so many Pegasi in such a short time." Brendel furrowed his brows. Mephistopheles had asked the question that troubled him the most. He had an army now, but how to send them out quickly was a big problem. He did not forget that he was currently in the depths of the dark forest, and it was at least a month's journey away from Aween's borders. "But at the latest, in a week's time, I will have the army move out, at least part of it." Mephisto nodded. "I heard that your territory is in trouble. How confident are you that you can win?" "So he's afraid that I will lose." Brando understood. He could not help but look at Mephisto and asked, "Speaking of which, I have always wanted to ask, Count Mephisto. Although I don't know what kind of agreement you have with the Duchess of Cruz, I have always wanted to ask. But you have chosen my ship. Do you know that my enemies are everywhere in Erewhon?" Perhaps it is not a wise choice for you to choose my side. Mephisto's gray eyes stopped on Brando. The young man's would reminded him of the young Veronica. No wonder that woman liked him so much. He smiled. Mr. Captain, you have many enemies, but I only have one. What do you think? Brando was stunned. He could not help but laugh. Indeed, the Ash-Sword Saint, who stood aloof from worldly affairs, only had one enemy, and that was the Cruz Empire. If Mephisto was not afraid of the Cruz Empire, why would he be afraid of the weaklings in Erewhon? So what do you mean, Count Mephisto? Brando asked. The Ash-Sword Saint looked at him and asked seriously, I came to ask if you are willing to accept my legacy and become the successor of my swordsmanship. What? Brendel was stunned. He resisted the urge to touch his face to see if there were any changes to his appearance after he left the loop of trade winds. Why did he suddenly become so lovable, and why did the flowers bloom when they saw him? Fortunately, he had the teachings of the ancient heroic spirit knight, Orthless. Even if a sword saint suddenly claimed to take him in as a disciple, he wouldn't be so shocked that he was speechless. He quickly calmed down and realized that Mephisto's actions might have political intentions. To put it bluntly, it was for the restoration of his kingdom. He knew that the Ash-Sword Saint was not a person who was interested in politics. The reason he restored his country was purely because of his personal beliefs. He was one of the few people in this era who was virtuous, but that did not mean that the Count was a fool. The Ash-Sword Saint knew very well that the duchy might be able to get his protection when he was around, but he could not always put all his energy into leading a country. His life's pursuit was still swordsmanship. Brando was different. Everyone could see that he was a lord first and a swordsman second. He could not even be considered a true swordsman. His passion for swordsmanship was even worse than Coden's. That was indeed the case. If Brendel had the experience of becoming a powerful wizard, he would not necessarily choose swordsmanship. What he pursued was the power that could help Owain rise to power, and not the mystical Tao. Mephisto was the opposite. He pointed out that Brando resembled Veronica as a metaphor. Veronica was the same as Brando. Veronica was a general and a duke of the empire. She was also a sword saint. Therefore, the gap between her and Mephisto in terms of swordsmanship was huge. Mephisto had been a famous sword saint for a long time, while Veronica's fame as the goddess of war was far greater than her title as the Azure Sword Saint. Brando calmed down after thinking about this. It was a good thing that the Ash Sword Saint wanted to accept him as a disciple. Mephisto's swordsmanship was at least an intermediate-level skill. It was not a bad thing to have such a powerful person as a backer. But at this moment Brendel had already accepted Orthless's inheritance. Orthless did not care about the Darkness Dragon's matter because they were from the same generation, and it was understandable that they appreciated each other's talents. However, it was hard to say whether the female knight could accept a guy who might not be that powerful to be on equal footing with her. But to Brando's surprise, Orthless did not object. "I suggest you accept it." Orthless was a little satisfied after hearing Brando's question. This meant that Brando did not only see her as a contractual spirit, but as a teacher. As a heroic spirit who had lived for thousands of years, she did not really care about this. But she was still very satisfied to find a young man with excellent character to be her inheritor. Mephisto's swordsmanship is very special. It's self-contained. After all, my vision is limited to 1,000 years ago. Odin only gave you the inheritance of his bloodline. In comparison, what he knows may be more useful to you. You don't have to care too much about my opinion. For me, as long as you can become stronger, that's what I want. Thank you. Brando was a little touched. Orthless's concern for him was like an elder sister protecting her younger brother. However, he did not immediately agree. Instead, he said to Mephisto, "Thank you for your kindness, Count Mephisto. But please allow me to think about it for a day." Mephisto showed a look of appreciation. He was very confident in his swordsmanship. If a normal person heard that he wanted to accept a disciple, they would have fainted from joy. But Brando was calm. For swordsmanship, it was necessary to be calm at all times. As a lord, it was naturally the same. "Of course. But you should understand that I want to teach you swordsmanship not only because you are the future lord. It's not because I need your help to revive my kingdom, but because I think you're good enough to inherit my swordsmanship. Although I haven't spent much time with you, I believe in Veronica's judgment of people," he added after thinking for a while. "You and Veronica have known each other for a long time." Brando could not help but blurt out. But he regretted it as soon as he said it. It was too gossipy, and he could not get rid of the habit of gossiping. Unexpectedly, Mephisto did not mind this question. He nodded. "The duchy where I am from has always been a vassal state of the empire. When I was young, I completed my studies in the empire. Veronica was my classmate back then." "What?" Brendel's gossipy soul was instantly ignited, and he could not help but yell out loud. He only knew that Mephisto was the archenemy of the Cruz Empire and had fought with Veronica many times. He did not expect the two to be childhood sweethearts. But just as he was about to continue asking, Mephisto cut him off. "Do you remember when I asked you about your army?" Brendel looked at the sword saint with a puzzled expression. His face looked like it was carved out of wood. "Actually, this is not a problem. There are 2 Silver Alliance archmages in the Green Tower. Master Tolman and I have some history, or rather, he owes me a favor. I can ask them for help." Mephistopheles replied. "A temporary teleportation array." Brando jumped up. A teleportation array that could transport thousands of people sounded unbelievable. If William and Tolman worked together, it would not be a problem. The remaining people could be sent away using Pegasi. This would solve the problem of transportation. He had been delayed for so many days. The biggest problem was how to send these people out of the Black Forest as quickly as possible. Even though the Druids had been gathering Pegasi, the Green Tower had just experienced the calamity of wolves. How could they gather so many Pegasi in such a short time? Brando immediately reacted and asked suspiciously, "Tolman is a silver citizen. According to the Holy Oath, they are not allowed to interfere in the conflicts of mortals." He wanted to see how Mephistopheles would answer, but what he didn't expect was that this old-fashioned sword saint actually put his index finger on his lips and made a gesture that said, "If you don't say it, I won't say it." Who will know? Brando was dumbfounded. Cheating. This is definitely cheating. Damn it, author's note, 4,500 words. This is the end of the war. The war against Tonajol is about to begin. Count Randner's influence may be great, but Madara is the real threat. Let's wait and see how Brendel will face Insursta's dragon and emerge victorious from this battle, and truly step onto the stage of history. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 479. In the name of mercy, I'll give you a chance to lay down your weapons and surrender. The knight raised his flag and shouted to the people below. Go back, and send my regards to your lord. Hank unsheathed his sword and shouted. The knight shook his head as if he had expected this and disappeared from the high ground. Why didn't you surrender? Hatch could not help but ask. Is surrender the only thing you learned from Grodin? The old scout turned around and looked at Hatch with his gray-brown eyes. Hatch was speechless. He did not know the identity of the old scout who spoke to him, but he should be one of the young lord's subordinates. He heard that he was also a mercenary and was one of the earliest to follow Grodin. He seemed to be one of the mercenaries from the Red Copper Dragon. However, Hatch did not believe the old scout's words. No matter how he looked at it, the old scout looked like a professional soldier. A few days ago, he was the first to discover the movements of Count Randner's army in the forest and led them to escape. Speaking of which, the Paulus Knight did indeed live up to his reputation. He actually dared to use the Highlanders as the vanguard during the attack on that day. The Highlanders were good at fighting in the forest. It was said that when they moved in the forest, their movements were like migrating deer. In other words, unless one was an experienced hunter, it would be very difficult to discover their tracks. Hatch knew that this was not an exaggeration. Everyone in the outpost was an experienced veteran, but none of them noticed the movements in the forest. Hatch could not help but look at the old scout in front of him. If this old man was a scout, he must be the best of the best. But the old scout did not mind and knocked on Hatch's chest. "Straighten up, lad. There's nothing to be afraid of. Abandoning Grodin was the best decision you've made in your life. Now that you're a true warrior, you must show me the courage of a warrior." The scouts burst into laughter. They were surprised that they could still laugh at this moment. The Highlanders were the first to arrive, and they were trapped in the forest until they were finally surrounded by Count Randner's knight subordinates. Hatch blushed a little. He knew that he had misspoken, even though he was forced to work for the young lord. But Count Randner would still see him as a traitor. The others could surrender, but he had no choice. He used to be a brave man, but Grodin's hands had slowly worn away his willpower. He took a deep breath, and his mind hardened like the sword in his hand. The older scout scolded the others. "What are you laughing at? Get ready for battle." More than 20 riders faced different directions. In such a desperate situation, the recruits would have been scared to the point that their faces turned pale and they would be at a loss of what to do. However, these knights appeared to be calm and collected. Their breathing was even and their bodies were tense. They were as dangerous as wild beasts that were waiting for an opportunity to break out of the encirclement. Pay attention to the direction of the enemy's attack and look for an opportunity to break out. The old man's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings of the forest like an agile beast. He gave his temporary subordinates an order in a low voice. A sharp sound came from the cold air, and Hatch felt a rider beside him fall off his horse. He quickly grabbed the rider and fixed him on the back of his horse. After the sound of an arrow, the arrows in the forest were like locusts that blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Their ears were full of whooshing sounds. Hatch was distracted, and an arrow flew towards his face. But there was already a knight beside him who pulled out his sword and deflected the arrow. Banging sounds could be heard from the group of scouts. If it was a noble's private infantry, they would have already broken down in such an environment. They would either be frozen in place or run around aimlessly. But all the scouts, including Hatch, felt that the arrows from the left and right were getting weaker. Hank whistled, and he and his horse turned around in the middle of the group. He pointed his sword forward. The riders understood what he meant, and the 20 or so men and horses did not collide with each other. They turned around beautifully and charged towards the right. Knight Wilson felt a chill in his heart. The report said that the ones who killed Grodin and took over Abes were a group of rebels, but looking at the quality of the scouts below, they did not seem like rebels at all. Even the best regular army in the kingdom did not have such quality. He could only hope that it was just a coincidence. He immediately ordered his attendant to pass down the order for the knight to attack. The archers on both sides would definitely not be able to stop the enemy's charge. Even though the order was passed down, Wilson felt a little uneasy. The first to rush out of the forest were the infantrymen. The nobles' private infantry raised their spears high. Even though they could not form a formation in the forest, they were still a great threat to the riders. Hatch leaned back to dodge a spear that was thrusting towards him, and the blade of his sword sliced through the enemy's neck. It was the long-awaited feeling of a sharp sword cutting through a weak throat. Blood spurted out like rain, and Hatch's nerves tensed up. He turned his head to the side to prevent the blood from splashing into his eyes. On the other side, he saw 2 spears piercing through the back of a rider's abdomen. That person had treated him to a drink a few days ago. Even though the taste was not good, Hatch remembered that the person was a mercenary. The mercenary was on the verge of death, but his hand was still holding onto the reins as he charged forward and crashed into the noble soldier. The noble soldier was sent flying as if he had no bones. Then, the mercenary and his horse fell down together. Hatch saw that the mercenary was already dead by the side of the horse. Hatch could not help but take a deep breath when he saw this. He slashed the 3 men in front of him. The noble's infantrymen were at most at the lower tier of iron ranked, and some of them were even white ranks. He did not need to worry about them because of the difference in strength. Suddenly, a whistle came from the forest, and the sound of hooves could be heard from the right. More than 10 knights suddenly broke through the fog and appeared in that direction. "Turn around and face the enemy." The old man's voice came from the back. The situation suddenly became dangerous. The scouts were already surrounded, and only a dozen or so of the original 20 or so riders that had broken through the encirclement remained. Moreover, the originally low morale of the noble's infantrymen was reinvigorated after receiving the reinforcements from the cavalry. These bastards were trying to restrain them and prevent them from escaping to face the enemy's cavalry. But when the others were unable to escape, a black shadow appeared. Hatch saw the old scout snatch a spear from one of the noble's infantrymen and cut him down with his sword. The old scout then turned around and charged towards the knight with a spear in his hand. 1 man and 1 horse, like the champion knight in the arena, charged forward with an unstoppable momentum. Hatch was not the only one who was shocked. The knight of Count Randner was also shocked. They were all light cavalry, and had never seen such a ferocious charge. While they were stunned, they were already pierced through by the old scout. The knight who was charging at the front screamed in agony, and his entire body was sent flying by the spear. But the spear was not meant to be used in a cavalry battle. The huge impact caused the spear to break, and Hank charged into the enemy's formation. He immediately unsheathed his sword and cut down another knight from his horse. Hatch almost bit his tongue off. In his opinion, the old man's strength was not that high. At most, he was at the level of an iron-ranked warrior, but not everyone could do such a smooth action. Which army did he belong to? This thought immediately appeared in his mind. Even Erwin's frontline army could not nurture such an excellent soldier. Especially the aura of a veteran, it was definitely not something that could be faked by an ordinary person. Hatch suddenly reacted and shouted at the others behind him, "Archers, archers! Cover him!" There was no need for him to remind them. A few of the knight of Count Randner had already taken out their longbows from their backs. They were about to surround the old man after their momentum was interrupted by Hank, but a few arrows pierced through the air and disrupted their formation. Hank took the opportunity to charge out from behind the cavalry's thin formation. The old man immediately turned around and raised his sword, nodding to his comrades. "Seize the opportunity and break out of the encirclement." Hatch seemed to have been possessed by a god at that moment. He understood the old man's intention in an instant. He felt his blood boiling, and adrenaline surged through his body, causing his eyes to turn red. He pointed his sword forward, and a dozen riders behind him responded in unison. The infantrymen of the nobles could no longer stop the crazy scout knight. Count Randner's knight of Count Randner's had just reorganized their formation, and an evenly matched opponent had already pounced on them. Knight Wilson almost fainted when he saw this scene. He originally thought that he had caught a juicy piece of meat, but he did not expect to kick an iron plate. He had more than 100 men and a dozen cavalrymen under him, but they could not stop more than 20 people. At least half of the enemy had escaped. F***CKU. How are we going to fight a veteran of the November War? Wilson was the most capable knight under Lord Paulus. Due to his rich experience in fighting against the Highlanders, he did not even think highly of Erwin's regular army, much less the rebel army. But this time, Wilson was sure that he had never fought such a strange battle in his life. He was much more knowledgeable than Hatch, and he could tell that Hank was a veteran of the November War. More than half of the veterans who survived the November War had received the Candlelight Badge before. Even if they were not knights, they would at least have half a fief. How could there be such a person in the rebel army? Wilson could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. He thought that he and his lord had fallen into a huge conspiracy. Just as Wilson was feeling the pain of losing his men, a steady stream of reports had been sent to Lord Paulus, who was now in charge of the army. This time, although this old knight had formed an alliance with two of his colleagues, with his rich combat experience, the other two knights could at most be his deputies. In this war, the only one who could be on equal footing with him was the famous general of Madara. Even though Tarkus wasn't considered young compared to humans, he was still considered to be one of the younger generation in Madara. In this War of the Black Rose, Madara's younger generation of generals had emerged one after another like the stars in the sky. Although the old knight Lord Paulus was working together with Tarkus, he could not help but sigh in his heart. Compared to Madara, his own country, Oween, was like an old man on the brink of death, with a gloomy atmosphere. For some reason, the old knight suddenly thought of the enemy standing in front of him. He heard that the enemy was also a young man. All of a sudden, Lord Paulus was interested in his opponent. However, this interest did not waver the old knight's will. The reports from the front lines indicated that the vanguard had already clashed with the enemy's sentries. To be honest, there was no need to think about it. Most of the reports were of a tragic victory, and there were even some battles where they lost. One had to know that they had the absolute advantage in terms of military strength. The strength of the enemy was beyond his expectations, but this was not enough to make him feel troubled. Regardless of the losses, at least the enemy's sentries were forced to retreat to the north of the Glass River. Their tactical goal had been achieved. Next, it was time to take down Glass Ferry and cross the river. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 481. The scouts in the forest crossed the river one after another, and news about Lord Paulus's knight's army was sent back. Brando's young servant, the Shire, was wearing a long robe and holding a staff as he stood on top of a sentry tower. He looked towards the north as far as he could, then turned around and said, "The casualties are more severe than expected. The scouts sent to the north have lost more than 40 to 50% of them. These are all experienced veterans. In 3 days, we have lost at least 50 men, and 3 times the number of injured soldiers. In the end," he added, "if I were his lordship, I would have just packed up and run away." "That's why you're not his lordship." The elven princess in silver armor glanced at him and answered calmly. Medisha was wearing a pointed helmet unique to the silver elves, which covered her small face. Her lips were tightly pursed, and she looked very heroic. "Is he plotting something by clearing out our scouts?" "Probably not. It's purely because he knows that we have subterranean dwellers in our hands, and he doesn't want to be attacked from the flanks. He doesn't want to repeat Lord Maxon's mistake." Medisha replied. "He's really difficult to deal with." The Shire shook his head and frowned. "I don't know if we can stall for 3 days. Count Randner's army has arrived. There's someone in the forest." The first reflection of light appeared in the forest, and an armored knight appeared in the forest on the other side of the river. Then, more soldiers appeared behind him. The knight stabbed the flagpole in his hand into the soft soil of the riverbank, and a sky-blue emblem unfurled in the wind. It was the emblem of Lord Paulus's hunting dog. "There's also one in the north and east." "So many." Soldiers wearing red and blue battle robes filed out of the forest, and there were no less than 1,000 of them. "Are they preparing to attack the city?" the Shire asked when he saw an archer shooting an arrow at the River Gree from afar. The arrow fell powerlessly on the river bank when it was about 50 steps away from the earth wall. Medisha shook her head. The enemy was just estimating the distance. They might launch a probing attack, but before that, they should observe for a while. As the youngest princess of the Silver Elves, Medisha had experienced as many battles as the other Silver Elves. The atmosphere before the great battle did not make her feel nervous. Instead, it gave her a sense of familiarity. It was just that there were too few enemies. There were too few enemies. The Silver Elf girl shook her head. Medisha wasn't wrong. At this moment, on a small hill 1,000 meters away, Lord Paulus was standing upright on his horse like a sharp sword. Grodden's most trusted retainer was surrounded by knights. His hand was on the hilt of his sword, and his eyes were as sharp as an eagle's as he scanned the river bank from afar. Lord Paulus was the oldest among Grodden's retainers. Even though he had a personal relationship with Lord Maxon, there was a huge difference in their ages. Lord Maxon was in his prime, while Lord Paulus' hair was already white. This old knight could be said to be a veteran of hundreds of battles. Although his fame did not spread as far as Ampere Seal and Buchy, he was a character that could make children stop crying among the barbarians of Trentheim. The Gree River ferry was right in front of them. Lord Paulus had been here once or twice before. He remembered that there was a flat grassland on the other side of the river, but what he saw now made him wonder if he was getting old. The lush forest completely covered the ferry, and only the shoal extending from the woods to the mouth of the river proved that they had not come to the wrong place. This was the season when the water level of the Gree River was at its lowest. Even infantry could wade through the cold water and cross the river from the shoal of the ferry. There seemed to be fortifications in the forest in the distance. The sentry towers that stood in the canopy proved this point. Since when was there a forest here? Lord Paulus remembered that the last time he came here was only 2 or 3 years ago, but the forest on the other side did not seem to have grown in such a short period of time. The towering ancient trees needed at least 2 or 3 people to wrap their arms around them, and they were more than 10 meters tall. Not to mention 2 or 3 years, even 20 or 30 years might not be enough. "There's a fort on the other side of the river." The sentry said that he saw a wall made of mud. "This forest proves that the rumors of the Druids working for the rebels are true," one of Lord Paulus's adjutants said. "The Druids have a way to turn the forest into this in such a short period of time. Is this an illusion or a forest that was transplanted from somewhere else?" Lord Paulus looked at the forest in front of him. It was clearly a primitive forest that was easy to defend and not easy to attack. It was unbelievable that the Druids had such an ability. Even if the forest was transplanted from somewhere else, it would not be easy to grow it in such a short period of time. It was not that he had never seen magic before, but most of the spells cast by wizards were fleeting. Even though it was powerful, it was still acceptable. However, this forest was right in front of their eyes. It stretched for at least a dozen miles, and was clearly presented before their eyes. It was neither an illusion nor an illusion. The knight beside him kept quiet. The Druids were a mysterious race. No one could tell what they were capable of. In most legends, it was not even certain if the Druids could cast spells. One said that the Druids were good at taming animals to fight for them. Another said that the Druids could transform into powerful animals to fight for them, just like the Beast Men. However, Lord Paulus quickly called for a wizard to explain the situation to them. The elder wizard was shocked when he heard that the forest had appeared out of thin air. The Druids could accelerate the growth of plants, but they were definitely not this powerful. The fact that the enemy could create such a large forest in such a short period of time meant that they had a shocking number of Druids. Or that the Druids working for them were at least at the level of the Druid masters in the Circle of Sky. A druid master was similar to the leader of the Silver Alliance's wizards. Lord Paulus did not believe that Brando had such people working for him, so he asked, how many druids would it take to create such a large forest in a few months? A few months. The wizard screamed and almost ran away. It would take at least a few thousand druids to create such a large forest in a few months. A few thousand. That's impossible. The rebels don't even have a few thousand people, a knight retorted. That means they have a druid grandmaster in their hands, or they have 30 grand druids forming a ring. A ring is a unit used by druids, and a ring of 30 grand druids is not inferior to a real army. The wizard replied gloomily. That's not right. If the enemy is so strong, why are they sitting here waiting for death? Could this forest be an illusion? Lord Paulus interrupted the argument and asked with what little magical knowledge he had. The wizard had thought of this as well, but before he could speak, the adjutant beside him shook his head. Our soldiers have already tested it. At least the first few are real. The wizard shook his head. It's more than 10 miles along the river. Just the first few are not simple. Can we attack with fire? Someone asked. The enemy has so many druids. Even if we attack with fire, they can easily extinguish it. Don't forget, they are the protectors of the forest. They are much more skilled in dealing with fire than you are. In any case, let's try it first. Lord Paulus made a decision without batting an eyelid. Let the soldiers prepare the fire arrows and launch a probing attack. Whether it succeeds or not, let's set up camp here. Let the knight of the grizzly bear domain prepare to chop down the trees. Count Randner's army had moved. A row of soldiers appeared from the forest. They wore gray-green battle robes and held shields in their hands. Their swords were strapped to their waists. The 3 rows behind them held long halberds, and long gray triangular flags were hung on the tips of the halberds. There were 3 knight domains north of Tonagel. Lord Paulus's family emblem was a hunting dog, Raleigh's family emblem was a grizzly bear, and Crewe's family emblem was a silver full moon. Thus, the flags raised by the soldiers were full moons. I thought the large forest behind us would scare them off. The Shire shook his head. Even though the druids had contributed precious magic seeds and worked tirelessly to complete this line of defense, there was still not enough time. This forest was actually only a part of the original forest from the fortress. The rest of the forest was created by him using illusions. The soldiers from Crewe's domain slowly moved forward. They were flanked by a large group of barbarians who wore ragged clothes and thick leather armor. They held sharp axes and round shields in their hands. The 3 armies slowly waded through the river and approached Grief Ferry. What did the Lord say? The Shire raised his hand and was about to give an order. They are just some nobles with shields and halberds who are not even Tier 1 soldiers. Just get rid of them. Is there a need to ask for my permission? Stupid. Medisha imitated Brando's tone and replied. Tier 1 soldiers. What the hell is that? Seal's eyebrows were almost knitted together. His lord seemed to like to talk about weird things. He still couldn't figure out the level-up theory from Fortress Reedon, and now he was talking about a grade 1 troop class. However, he did not have time to think about it. Rows of Count Randner's archers walked out from the back of Crewe's infantry. These professionally trained longbowmen were all elites under Lord Paulus. They held their longbows and used their arrows to draw a trench in the ground. They opened the leather pouches at their waists and poured the liquid inside into the trench. It's oil. Fire arrows. The Silver Fairy Princess's expression changed. A fire dragon ignited in the forest. The human soldiers had already raised their longbows. Burning arrows were knocked on their bows. Following a command from the forest, the bowstrings vibrated in unison. The next moment, almost everyone in the forest saw a cloud of fire fly into the sky, turning the sky blood red. Then, the cloud of fire stopped at the highest point and smashed down on their faces. Fire arrows. Accompanied by a scream, the fire arrows whistled and smashed into the forest. Fortunately, the trees were extremely dense, and most of the arrows were blocked by the canopy and branches. Only a small number of arrows passed through the gaps and fell into the mercenaries' camp. The fire arrows did not cause any direct damage, but Lord Paulus, who was watching from afar, did not have any expression on his face. He was waiting for the follow-up effect, and he was about to see it. The longbowmen raised their longbows, and the second wave of fire arrows was already knocked on their bows. P.S. Update late. I have no way to go online these few days. I hope everyone can forgive me. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 482. As soon as the fire arrows came into contact with the trees, they immediately burst into flames. The water in the trees evaporated and turned into thick smoke. The Crus infantrymen and mountain warriors in gray-green battle robes took the opportunity to sneak into the forest. The attack was so successful that even Lord Paulus, who was observing the battle from afar, raised his eyebrows slightly. But it was at this moment that a muffled sound of thunder came from the distant forest. A large patch of dark clouds gathered above the canopy at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then, accompanied by a flash of golden lightning, a sudden downpour poured down, almost instantly drenching the fire that had just been ignited. As soon as the fire was extinguished, the thunderstorm continued to spread. A few lightning bolts landed on the beach at the edge of the forest, exploding right in the middle of the Crus infantry and mountain warriors who were gathered there. After a few loud booms, blood and flesh splattered everywhere. The golden lightning bolts created a few large craters on the ground, and the rocks that were blown away fell on the heads of the soldiers nearby like hailstones. The soldiers of Crus immediately lost their morale. They did not care if there were still archers behind them as they turned around and fled at a speed 10 times faster than when they came. These nobles' private soldiers did not have the will to fight. Even though the Highland warriors who accompanied them were strong, it was a pity that this battle was meaningless to them. When the soldiers of Crus retreated, they naturally turned around and fled as well. But compared to the soldiers of Crus who were scared out of their wits and scattered like sand, the Highland warriors gathered together in an orderly manner even though they were retreating. The two knights who were accompanying Lord Paulus saw this scene from afar and turned to look at the true commander of Count Ranner's army. They were shocked by the Highlanders' combat prowess, and when they thought of Lord Paulus who had led his army to victory over the Highlanders and forced them to submit to him, the two knights fell silent. Of course, they were unwilling to submit to Lord Paulus, but when they saw the performance of their own troops, they could only remain silent. At this moment, the dark clouds had already passed over the soldiers of Crus and arrived at the archers' formation on the other side of the river. A premonition of impending doom filled the heart of Sir Wiggins, the commander of the archers. "Retreat! Quickly retreat!" He immediately screamed, but he was still one step too late. He saw a golden net fall from the sky, instantly exploding among the three groups of archers. Almost in the blink of an eye, more than 2 groups of noble archers who had been trained for a long time were directly reduced to ashes. Sir Wiggins was struck by the lightning as well, but he was protected by the electric cage effect from head to toe. However, the adjutant beside him was not so lucky and was turned into charcoal. Wiggins crawled up from the ground, his face covered in dust and grime. He couldn't help but grieve. An entire company of archers had been crippled in a single round of attacks. Although they had only lost 20 to 30% of their archers, the rest had long since been scared out of their wits. They wouldn't be able to return to battle for a while. Not to mention that the dark clouds above were still surging, and the second round of lightning was about to descend. The archers immediately collapsed like the soldiers in front of them. They screamed and turned to flee. Mortals had no way of resisting such a powerful force of nature. Lord Paulus's knowledgeable and experienced knight subordinates might be a little better off, but they definitely wouldn't be the noble's private soldiers. But at this moment, the sound of chanting suddenly rang out from the forest. The cadence of the incantation seemed to gather an invisible force in the air, and even the air pressure dropped a little. The dark clouds in the sky suddenly paused, and then dissipated piece by piece. In the blink of an eye, the clouds parted and the sun could be seen. The forest was silent at first, and then cheers rang out from the north bank of River Gree. It's a dispel spell. There are at least 3 chanting points. On Brando's side, a druid covered in grass from head to toe listened attentively and said, "No, it's 4. The Shire shook his head. 4. The others didn't dare to refute. The first batch of druids sent to ABs didn't have any great druids, and the Shire could be said to be the #1 spellcaster in the area. High-ranked spellcasters were rare to begin with. It was said that Count Randner had 2 gold-ranked magi by his side, but this time, there might not even be 1. If there are 4 magi here, it doesn't mean that there are only 4 of them. It's a pity that we don't know how many of them there are. According to the reports, there might be more than 30 of them, including silver-ranked spellcasters. From the looks of it, it's very likely." Cornelius replied. He was the nominal commander of the mercenaries here, and the more reliable Rabban was sent to help command the 800 subterranean dwellers. Other than that, Brando also ordered Copper Dragon, Reto and the others to replace Yuta's mercenary group in the silver mine. Count Randner should not know that the silver mine had fallen, so Brando hoped that Reto would be able to surprise him. It was a dangerous mission, and Reto and the others were veterans of the November War, so they were naturally more qualified than Yuta's mercenaries. As for Yuta, she had already been transferred back to the front lines against Count Randner's army. She was also very satisfied with this arrangement. The beautiful red-haired mercenary leader stood beside Medisha and voiced her doubts. How can Lord Paulus have so many magi? Even if Lord Paulus has been on the front lines for years, it's still impossible. Don't forget about Lord Cruss and Grizzly Bear, but I think Count Randner had also transferred some of his own magi, or else there wouldn't be any silver-ranked magi. Cornelius replied. 30 magi. Ever since the November War, Erewhon has never had a magi group with more than 30 magi. Count Randner really spared no effort to intimidate these small fries. Gaspard, who had been following Brando since Fortress Reden, could not help but mock him. As a half-noble, he was very clear about Erewhon's past battles. Gaspard's words made everyone laugh. They had more than 100 druids on their side, not to mention the fact that the young lord's magi was a gold-ranked magus. The young lord did not have a large army, but the quality of his soldiers was unbelievably high. Ordinary soldiers were either experienced mercenaries or veterans of the November War. At the very least, they were soldiers of the Erewhon army who had fought against Madara. Very few of them were below iron-ranked, and some of them were even above the mid-tier of iron-ranked. Other than that, there was also a group of subterranean dwellers. Their individual strength was at least above iron-ranked, and there were quite a number of them who were at the peak of iron-ranked. The 2 armies added up to close to 3,000 men, and mages accounted for more than a tenth of this army. This was extremely rare in the entire history of Awin's wars, and it was simply inconceivable. If this news were to spread, it would probably cause an uproar in the outside world, and they would have to reevaluate the strength of the new Lord of Tonajol. However, Brando deliberately suppressed this news because he knew that sometimes, a surprise would leave a deeper impression than an established fact. This time, the young lord wanted the whole of Erewhon to remember his name, and who was the rightful Lord of Tonajol. Gaspard's words made the dark clouds in everyone's hearts dissipate, as if the forest had made Count Randner's army less terrifying. However, the Shire still had to give them a heads-up, and he waved his hand. Even if that's the case, the enemy's absolute strength is still much greater than ours. Count Ranner's army is led by 3 Night Lords, and they have an army of 20,000 men. The Highlanders have about 10,000 men, which means that the army hidden in the forest in front of us, the Shire pointed to the north of the Gree River, they might be 30 times more powerful than us. Everyone became solemn again. This was something that they had known for a long time. Furthermore, the 3 Night Lords have elite knights under their command. There are at least 100 of them in total, maybe even more. These Night Lords are at least silver-ranked, and we just happen to lack such a force. The subterranean dwellers can fight against them, but Lord Ranner made it clear that as long as Madara does not appear on the battlefield, the subterranean dwellers cannot appear. That's why the enemy has an absolute advantage in terms of silver-ranked fighting power. Apart from Lord Paulus, the Grizzly Bear Lord and Crust Knight are both gold-ranked fighters under Count Ranner, and there's no guarantee that they don't have any hidden trump cards. Even if they only have 2 gold-ranked fighters, it can only be said to be a draw against Medisha and I. If there's a third, we'll still be at a disadvantage. Then what should we do? The Shire's words made Marlins a little dumbfounded. It's fine, just do as Lord Ranner says. The Shire looked at everyone present. Lord Ranner's words. Brando had told them to delay Count Ranner's army as much as possible, but at that time, Count Ranner's army was not as terrifying as it was now. There were 3 Night Lords and 30,000 Highlanders, not to mention Madara's undead eyeing them from the sidelines. Brando had promised them victory, but that was in the past. Could they still win now? Most of the people who followed Brando had a kind of blind trust in his words. The young lord's promise of victory had never failed, and as long as he moved forward, then the path of his sword would lead to victory. The young lord was like the most legendary heroes of the ancient times. When he proudly declared that he would obtain victory, then victory was already in his hands. But at this moment, everyone present could not help but be silent. They were warriors who had been through hundreds of battles, and could laugh and joke in the most dangerous of situations, but that did not mean that they were stupid. In their original confidence, the only way for them to win was to stall for as long as possible until Count Ranner's army ran out of food and retreated. But that would require both sides to pay a terrible price. As warriors, this was not unacceptable because they had already sworn their loyalty to the young lord, and everyone was prepared to shed blood. But Brendel's promise to them was to completely defeat Count Ranner's army head-on. How was that possible? The Druids naturally thought that the Shire was only trying to boost their morale. Yuta and Cornelius, who had witnessed Brando's miraculous feats, had a headache. Both of them could not think of how Brando would achieve victory no matter how hard they racked their brains. The Shire and Medisha looked at each other and smiled in the face of these various gazes. Indeed, because the upheaval in the loop of trade winds would soon spread throughout Erewhon and Wonde. Everyone would remember this battle. The young mage lifted his head, his gaze falling upon the dark forest to the north of the Gree River. Unfortunately, Lord Paulus did not feel the gaze that penetrated through the distance at that moment. The elderly knight was counting the casualties. In fact, the Crus army didn't lose much. Only a dozen or so of the infantrymen were left behind. However, the fact that an entire squadron of archers had to withdraw from the battle before they could even see the face of the enemy made him feel a little heartbroken. Even though Brendel had mobilized more than 20,000 soldiers, he did not have many professional soldiers. He only had 1.5 columns of noble archers, and a large portion of them were the private soldiers of Count Ranner. If he lost too many of them, he would not be able to report back to Count Ranner. He could not help but turn around and ask, that lightning just now was a druid spell. Can an iron-ranked druid cast such a terrifying spell? The mage beside him nodded, that's a summon lightning spell, but 1 or 2 druids won't be that terrifying. The spell just now needs at least 10 people to cast it together. Furthermore, an iron-ranked would need to rest for at least a day after casting it. But if it's a druid grandmaster, then it's a different story. The old knight interrupted the mage's words. He still believed that there was no druid grandmaster in the rebel army. In other words, they can't cast that spell continuously. My lord, there's no need to be afraid even if they cast it continuously. Compared to the 10 people they need to cast the spell together, we only need 2 or 3 people to dispel it. Moreover, that spell consumes a lot of energy for an iron rank, but the dispel magic consumes only an average amount of energy for us. Magic is actually much more useful for defense than offense. If I were them, I'm afraid I wouldn't use that spell again. They were probably just using it as a deterrent. The magus lowered his head and replied respectfully. Lord Paulus nodded. As long as it was not an AoE spell, he did not need to worry too much. The difference in military strength between the two sides was too great, and he did not need any extra stratagems. Moreover, the expenditure of 20,000 soldiers was too great, and he did not want to waste time. He planned to end the war in a straightforward manner from the start. As long as he crossed the River Gree, then taking Ab's Leng would only be a matter of days. Ending the war in a week was within his acceptable range. Rebel army, Erewhon. These 2 words circled around in his mind, but in the end, all his thoughts turned into a confident smile on his face. As a general who had won countless victories, he did not have any reason to believe that he would lose when he had the absolute advantage. The old knight smiled faintly. It was a smile that represented pity for the enemy and a sigh for the kingdom. 100 years ago, he had never heard of a rebellion in Erewhon that would cause such a huge commotion. Even though his lord, Count Ranner, had displayed his strength, it did not change the fact that the kingdom was on the verge of collapse. Not to mention 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, even in the most remote places, the lives of nobles would not be threatened. Lord Paulus sighed and muttered, Brando, is it? Let this old man take the last stand for this kingdom. He threw his dagger into the middle of the map on the table, where Ab's was located. Victory seemed to be within his grasp. Grodon's retainer, a veteran knight, no longer hesitated. He ordered Count's army to set up camp in the evening and prepare for the final assault after a night's rest. They wanted to take down the enemy's defensive line in one fell swoop. Lord Paulus was not afraid that the rebel army would ambush them in the middle of the night. With his experience, he would not make such a low-level mistake. If the enemy was really that stupid, he would not mind ending the war earlier. Unfortunately, the enemy's leader was as shrewd as he expected. After a night of silence, the real attack began the next morning. The sky was just beginning to brighten, and Charles and Medici could already see the shadows of countless soldiers in the forest on the other side of the river. They are cutting down trees to build bridges. They are definitely taking advantage of our lack of manpower. Charles turned back and said. Medici nodded. The test had begun. Both of them had the same thought in their minds. P.S. I'm back. I'll be back to normal from today onwards. The weather is cold, and I'll catch a cold if I go out. Everyone, remember to wear more clothes. I'm not in the best condition, but it's the end of the month. I'll be leading a party tonight, so you don't have to wait any longer. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this novel, you're welcome to vote for it at Chidian.com. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 483. Battle cries shook the heavens and earth. It was as if black arrows covered the sky, and countless undead swarmed past her from the crimson earth. Behind her, she could not tell if it was the screams of human misery, despair, or anger. Freya tried her best to turn around, but she could not move. Then, she saw a knight wrapped in white phosphorus flames riding on a skeletal warhorse towards her. The knight looked down at her from above, and she had to relive that burning gaze every night for the past week. But the dream was so real that Freya was too nervous to speak. She stared at the knight with wide eyes. You shouldn't have woken up. The fate of the descendants of the Valkyries is too heavy, the knight said with a hoarse voice. Don't give up everything for an unrealistic belief. The knight raised his sword. Back off, or you will have nowhere to run. The voice was like a stern warning. The knight's hand moved forward, and the cold blade pierced her heart. Ah! Freya screamed in fright. She sat up on the bed, drenched in cold sweat. She could not help but hold her chest and gasp for breath. She did not know when this nightmare that tormented her every day started to haunt her. She did not know if it was some sort of omen, or if it was because of the pressure from the recent training. She could feel her heart pounding, but the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor soon drowned out the sound. The dim light made Freya realize that she had returned to reality. The footsteps outside should be the knight's messenger. Ever since the war in the south began, the number of messengers had increased by several times. Large and small factions were temporarily attracted by the sudden war, and even forgot that the kingdom itself was on the brink of civil war. Everyone knew that the dukes in the north would wait until the snow melted before they would cross Ampyr's Seal to the south. In comparison, Randnor's war was more like the appetizer before the main meal, as Oberway jokingly called it. This appetizer was a great mockery to the Aruan nobles, but the nobles did not seem to mind. They were happily waiting to see how many teeth Count Randnor had left. The question was how many teeth Count Randnor had left. Of course, it was not as if no one in the Royal Knight Academy believed that Brando could win. At the very least, Freya would be anxiously waiting for news from the front line every day. The messenger passed through the long corridor and through the courtyard behind the dormitory, where news of the war was first delivered to Princess Griffin. The half-fairy princess coldly read the few lines of words on the parchment in her hand before putting it down. News of Lord Paulus's army clashing with the rebels had reached her, but there was no substantial progress. In a day or two, Griffin thought to herself. She said to the messenger, make a few copies and give them to the other lords. Should I call the other lords over? There's no need for that. There will be a tournament in the month of winter and a hunt in the twilight of winter. Help me prepare them, I want to see it personally. The messenger bowed and left. Cunning Fox Makarov could not help but shake his head and chuckle after reading the report in his hand. He wanted to put the report on top of the tall stack of documents on the desk beside him, but after thinking about it, he stopped and walked out of his room with the thin piece of parchment in his hand. He went straight to the Violet Count's residence with the report in his hand, but was stopped by a servant who told him that his friend had gone to the tournament. Makarov remembered that there was such a matter and hurriedly borrowed a carriage to go to the tournament a few miles away. The tournament in the month of winter had a long history in Aruan and even the whole of southern Cruz. The events included horsemanship, spearmanship, and swordsmanship. The main purpose of the tournament was to prove the glory of the knight of each region. The youths were passionate about such events and the citizens could also satisfy their hero complex. In the Royal Knight Academy, such events were even more meaningful. The students of the academy would compete fiercely to prove that they were the best knight of the year and would compete fiercely for the crown woven from holly leaves. Preparations for the tournament started in the wee hours of the morning and there was already a sea of people in the morning. However, Makarov was indeed Bali's good friend. It did not take him long to find him in the crowd. The Violet Count, who was also from Lantern Island, was meticulously dressed in a purple coat with silver trimmings that matched his identity. There were 3 silver leaves on the cuffs of the coat that represented his identity. He did not wear a hat, but he held a goblet in his hand. He stood alone at the highest point of the wooden grandstand that had just been set up, enjoying the cold wind. Bali saw his good friend walking towards him and raised his glass with a smile. I know you don't like to drink Toldo wine of 5 or 7 years. Actually, I don't like to drink any kind of wine. Makarov replied unhappily. I know. Alcohol affects your judgment. I don't make judgments anyway. The Violet Count shrugged. Did you receive the news from Tonajol? Makarov did not want to continue the topic. You mean the joke about how many teeth an old dog has? Bali asked casually. I want to ask you, how long do you think the rebels can last? What do you think? Don't you think that young man has a chance of winning? Bali played with his glass. He has the silver elves and the dragons behind him. The silver elves are just passing by. What about the dragons? The dragons wouldn't think that their interference in the affairs of the humans would cause a backlash from the Holy Cathedral. No one wants to start a holy war, not even the most lawless Grand Dukes in the kingdom. That's true. But that young man is not as useless as those Meng family members. With Lord Paulus's personality, he might suffer a great loss. Makarov sneered, is that so? I think he's laughably stupid. What do you mean? Bali asked deliberately. I thought that he would split up and drag Lord Paulus back to Tonajol. The cost of 30,000 soldiers is an astronomical figure, and with the distrust between the humans and Madara, Lord Paulus will definitely lose. But that young man has built a line of defense on the spot and is prepared to fight Lord Paulus in a fair and square battle, disappointing our Mr. Cunning Fox, right? Indeed, it's troublesome to have one less person to restrain Count Randner, but I heard that he managed Tonajol well. Perhaps he's doing this to ensure the next year's harvest. Have you ever thought that if he survives this battle, he will become a real threat to Count Randner? The Violet Count raised his eyebrows and asked. Makarov looked at his good friend. Bali laughed. Indeed, I also think that he won't be able to survive, but there might be a miracle. You know, miracles will always appear when people hope for them. Right now, we need this miracle, so I'm praying with all my heart. Maybe Lady Martha will give me a miracle because of me. However, it was a little too unreliable to pin one's hopes on something as intangible as a miracle. That was why Makarov knew that his friend was just joking. That was how Makarov always was. However, the two of them who stood at the top of Erewhon probably did not expect that their unintentional conversation would be overheard by a young girl who was preparing for the upcoming match. Freya, what's wrong? A female student nudged the girl who was at a loss, and the latter seemed to have just regained her senses. Why do you look like you've lost your soul? Are you thinking of a man? The girl could not help but giggle. What nonsense are you talking about? Freya's face turned red. When it came to matters between men and women, the noble girls were much bolder than her. Even though everyone was still talking about it verbally, the girl who came from the countryside of Butchie was still unable to take it. However, compared to this, she was more concerned about the things she heard earlier. She could not help but ask, Disha, who were those people talking up there? She was asking the girl beside her, who was her roommate. Her name was Disha, and just like what she said, she was a girl from a small noble family. She was chosen to be here because of her talent in magic. It seems to be the viewing platform for the nobles. Those people there are all big shots. The girl replied, small nobles like us compared to the real big nobles up there is like the difference between a commoner and a noble. If we don't get permission, we can't even talk to them. It's extremely rude. She seemed to have just remembered Freya's background and could not help but exclaim, "Aw, I'm sorry, Freya. You know I didn't mean it that way. But then again, once you leave this place, you're at least half a noble." The girl said in a somewhat unhurried manner. Freya only smiled at her, but her heart was in a mess. She did not know what the situation was like on Brando's side, but now that the big shots who controlled the fate of the kingdom did not think highly of him, did it mean that the situation over there was very dangerous? After all, Freya was a native of Erewhon, and her reverence for authority was not something that could be changed in a short period of time. At this moment, she only wished that she could grow a pair of wings and fly to Brando's side to get through this crisis with that young man, or at the very least, die together with him. Freya did not know what she was thinking in her heart. She could not help but think of the little things that she knew about Brando. Of course, not all of them were good memories. She could not help but think of the time at the Golden Tree, when she went to look for him and the Roman out of goodwill. He actually scolded her and the Roman, and often took advantage of her and the Roman. When she thought of this, Freya's face turned red, but for some reason, there was a little sweetness in her heart. But this little sweetness turned into fear and depression in the blink of an eye, and she did not even hear the voice calling her name from outside. "It's your turn, Freya." The girl at the side could not stand it anymore. "What's wrong with you? Are you feeling unwell?" No. Freya only just remembered that she was here to participate in the tournament. She panicked a little and picked up the spear, but was immediately rolled her eyes. "This is a swordsmanship tournament," the girl said in annoyance. "Ah." Freya wanted to find a hole to hide in at this moment. "Forget it, but don't force yourself." The girl sighed and looked at her a little worriedly. "Remember to get a good result." "Sigh, if I didn't know you well, I would have thought that you were infatuated with some guy." Freya had just walked out of the spectator stand, and when she heard this sentence, she almost fell to the ground. Of course, she would never admit that she was thinking of Brando before. But it was easier said than done to get a good result. Her spear and equestrian skills were at the bottom of the rankings. Although her swordsmanship was slightly better, it was still not good enough among the outstanding youths in Erewhon. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheatien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.